Yeah.
Okay, then we will start with... Beatrice, would you like to start?
Very happy to do so. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to open this conference. It's a really special occasion, in my view, that already has some history, but definitely this collaboration that is behind such a high-level conference between several departments and starting with Geneva, of course, the Graduate Institute, CEPR, and others that have joined together to bring a fantastic program. Over the course of several sessions, I am really looking forward to this conference. I thank you very much for all the organizers and participants. And it's over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the CEPR Economic History Programme. And I think I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors, the Graduate Institute Geneva, University of Geneva, the Swiss National Bank, and of course CEPR. I'd also like to thank the organising committee. That's Rui Estevez, Juan Flores, Pilar Nogues Marco, Tobias Straumann, Nathan Zussman, and Martina Vierengo. I want to particularly emphasize how hard they've worked over the last couple of years, because initially they went to a lot of trouble to organize the 2020 Symposium as an in-person event. In the end, that had to be postponed. We had, of course, expected to be able to hold the event in person this year, but again, that's not been possible. Undaunted by these setbacks, the committee have nevertheless retained faith in the possibility of an in-person meeting in Geneva, and are now planning to organise the 2023 Symposium. In the meantime, next year, we'll be going to Odense, where Paul Sharp will be organising the 2022 Symposium at SDU. Of course, the idea of the annual symposium is to bring together researchers from all strands of the CEPR Economic History Programme. This year, freed from capacity constraints by the online format, we've been able to open up our meeting to a wider audience. I understand we've got more than 200 people registered, so it's great to have you here. We're covering a wide range of topics, including human capital and religion, human capital and exploitation, state capacity and institutions, trade and depression, money and power, and inequality and fracture endowments. Before we begin, let me just remind you that each paper has been allocated 30 minutes. That's 20 minutes for the speaker, followed by 10 minutes for questions. And I should warn you that chairs have been asked to keep the sessions strictly to time. During the Q&A sessions, priority is going to be given to other speakers on the programme who have microphone and camera access. So you can indicate that you wish to ask a question by either raising your hand or typing in the chat box. Others can also type in questions using the Q&A facility, and then the session chair will read out those questions if time allows. So let me finally end by saying, please keep your questions and answers short, as we obviously don't have very much time for each Q&A session. With those introductions out the way, let me now introduce the first session. So I'm going to be chairing the first session on human capital and religion. And the first paper is by Laura Panzer, who's in Australia now, where it's getting very late. So without further ado, let me hand over to Laura, who's going to tell us about ecclesiastical power, religiosity, and persecutions over 800 years.
Thanks. Let me share my screen. So is this big enough, or you want it bigger?
It could be bigger.
Go on, let's try again, and then I'm gonna do this. How does it look?
Well, it could still be big, but
that's the biggest I can do. I'm on full screen. Okay, thanks everyone for giving me the chance to present my work. So this is a paper that looks at the relationship between religion and persecution, as the title says, and it's joint work with Umer Khalil, who's at Monash. So understanding this relationship between religion and violence, persecutions, remains a very hotly debated question and has generated a large amount of work across various literatures and across various disciplines, stretching from history to sociology, anthropology, political science, and economics. And maybe the reason why this still remains a hotly debated question is the fact that religion has two faces. So on the one hand, it contributed to episodes of violence throughout history. And this is plausibly because, especially for monotheistic religions, religion are founded on this idea of the existence of one true God, which by definition creates outsiders. On the other hand, we've also seen in history lots of episodes in which religion can provide a bridge to peaceful coexistence. So in this paper, we look at the relationship between local religious practices. So we really want to focus on local religion, and we ask whether whether religion was instrumental in the persecution of minorities in Europe. So we contribute to this debate by looking at a long period in history and also a large geographic spectrum. So we collected data on over 2,100 cities and across more than 800 years. So the two types of persecutions we focus on are the persecution of the Jewish people, so expulsions and pogroms, as well as the witch trials during the European Middle Ages. So starting from the European Middle Ages and going through to 1850. So specifically, we ask whether religious beliefs intensified the persecution of minorities. And again, we want to focus on local popular religious practices rather than top-down decisions from the Vatican. So this is the contribution that we want to bring to the literature. And after having identified a relationship between between religion and persecution, we investigate the channels behind it. We contribute to various literature, but specifically we contribute to the literature on the determinants of persecutions, which has so far focused predominantly on the economic and cultural motives behind persecutions. While when looking at religion, the available literature that had looked at Christianity, since that's the dominant religion in our sample, the literature has not studied this relationship systematically across time and space, and most of the available studies are more focused on a single country or a specific time period. So we want to contribute to this literature by producing a new proxy, so a new way to measure the pervasiveness of religion, and we identify this with the spread of the cults of saints in Western Christianity. the value added of this proxy is really the fact that we can have a wider historical and geographic variation in local religious practices and beliefs that allows us to test this relationship in a comprehensive manner. Then we also exploit the gender dimension of our data sets or our saints data to test the progressiveness of gender norms, since it has been argued, especially in the sociology literature, that the fact that women became saints could be a proxy for gender norm progressiveness. Somehow it's not going forward. Okay. A bit of a background for those of you who don't know much about saints. As I said, saints we consider saints as the expression of local religious practices, and we focus on saints people that became saints, or the saints that were venerated before the 11th century, because before this period, canonization of saints was not a centralized process. It was done per viam cultus, so it was really largely established by local communities and was the result of a public cult at the community level. So who were saints? How could people become saints? So initially, the first saints were martyrs. So they were Christians that lost their lives because of their faith. And later on, they were holy people who lived lives dedicated to the pursuit of God. They had lives of Christian virtue, heroic Christian virtue. And as I said, they were designated by local communities. To understand better the relationship between the believers and saints, we have to think of them as a sort of intermediaries between the believers and God. In fact, believers usually pray to the saints. They ask for intercession. So that's the role of the saints. That's why we believe this is a good proxy of local religious beliefs. So again, we use 1100 as a cutoff to avoid to confound our results with this idea that the church decided where to locate saints or where to canonize saints. So up until 1100, this process was really a bottom-up process. It's only during the 1600s that it becomes a fully centralized top-down process. So the additional benefit of using 1100 as a cutoff is that then our estimation won't suffer from reverse causality, in the sense that we use our persecution data starts from 1100 onwards, so it's in a post period. So we get our data from the Martyrologium Romanum, which is the official martyrology of the church, which has little hagiographies, so the saints biography for all these saints that are venerated, and we combine it with data from Bibliotheca Sanctorum, which is a 25-volume book on Christian saints and their lives. So a bit more of a background. The existence of the cults of saints allows us to produce this new proxy that that allows us to quantify the religiosity of the general population. So why do we think that saints veneration is an expression of religiosity? First of all, the loca sanctorum, so the places where saints are, so their graves and their relics were regularly visited by pilgrims. Moreover, people used to, and still Catholics still adopt saints' name as baptism in a sign of devotion. There are lots of religious festivals around feast days that see the participation of large groups of believers, and there's also there used to be, and there still is, this common practice of burial ad sancto, so being buried near the vicinity of a saint in order to have his aura and his protection also after life. So this is an image of a recent image from recent years of a patron feast day in Catania, Sant'Agata, which is a patron, the protector of Catania. So you can see how there are thousands of people in the streets parading the saint around the city, holding big candles and praying together. So this is really a time and a place of increased religious fervor. So this is a map of our data. So the red dots represent the cities that had at least one saint before 1100. Most of the cities in our sample have only one saint, more than 60%. So in our preferred specification, we'll just look at a dummy variable. Is a saint venerated, yes or no? And then we have also a large spatial variation in the persecution of the Jewish people, so pogrom and expulsions, as well as witchcraft trials. So where do we get our data from? So the novelty of the paper lies in the religiosity proxy. The other data we take them from what is already available. So the witchcraft trials come from Leeson and Brass. And it's a sample of more than 43,000 women prosecuted for witchcraft. And while these processes were proper judicial processes that occurred in ecclesiastical courts, in order to identify who were the witches, that really relied on a network of local people that could identify who engaged in black magic and who were the witches. Don't know why it keeps going back. And then what do we know so far from the literature in terms of the causes, the determinants of witch hunting? We have three main hypotheses. People have looked at religious competition between Catholics and Protestants. Then since Emily Oster's paper, there are papers that look at economic causes of persecution. And there are also other papers that look at the role of legal institutions. In terms of Jewish expulsions and pogroms, we use the data from Anderson, Johnson, and Koyama. So we include both expulsions and pogroms. And it is very well documented that there was widespread anti-Semitism in popular European Christian culture. Think of the belief of blood libels or well poisonings. And there's a very huge literature that has investigated the Jewish persecution. But as I said, most of it has focused on the economic and cultural factors behind it. So this is our empirical specification. So in our most baseline setting, we have a cross-section where we regress persecution that happened post-1100 on pre-1100 saints. We have a bunch of controls, population density as a proxy of economic development, the presence of Jewish population when we focus on Jewish persecutions, latitude, longitude, as well as bishopric cities. So we control for whether a city was archbishopric or bishopric, in order to really capture the presence of ecclesiastical power, which is something that we would like to separate from our religiosity proxy. So the effect of saints should be, of our saints dummy, should be above and beyond the presence of ecclesiastical power as proxied by bishopric cities. And then we also control for saint types. So we exploit the richness of our data set that allows us to identify whether saints were from high-ranked secular or ecclesiastical occupations. So if they were kings or queens, or popes, abbots and bishops, vis-a-vis laymen and lay women, monks, local priests, and so on and so forth. So we cluster the standard errors at the country level, but because we have only 24 countries, so we use modern boundaries. We also do a wide cluster bootstrap for the small number, to account for the small number of clusters. So these are the results that look at witch trials and witch killings. So if we, for example, look at column 2, we see that having a saint, venerating a saint leads to a 15.8 percentage point increase in the probability of witch trial. And if we look at column 5, a 9.6 percentage point increase in the probability of witch killings. We also find, so in columns 3 and 6, we look at this gender flavor. So we look at whether having a female saint had any effect on these types of persecution. And given the gender dimension of persecution, it makes sense to test this relationship with the witch trials, given that all witches were female, pretty much the vast majority of them. So we actually confirm this hypothesis put forward by Schulenburg that having female saints can be considered as a proxy for relatively progressive gender norms, because that's what these estimates suggest, that having a female presence relative to a male presence reduces the likelihood of witch trials or witch killings. Then when moving to the Jewish persecutions that here include both expulsions and pogroms, we also see this positive relationship between saints' presence and the probability of persecution, while we find no effect on having a female saint, which makes sense in the sense that Jewish persecutions were not gendered. Those include both men and female. In order to account for omitted variables or unobserved variables that could potentially explain our results, we add a bunch of additional controls, including institutional controls, such as university presence and parliamentary activity. We include geography controls, as well as distance from Rome, distance from the sea. And we also control for capital city as a proxy for strength of political power of a city, to again take into account for potential political factors that were behind the persecution. And we find that the results continue to hold. Then I won't have much time to go into the details of this, but we also look at two potential and important confounders. One is the Black Death and the Black Death shocks that were associated with an increase in persecution. So could it be that our results are driven by the Black Death? And we rule this out. So if there are questions, I can show you also the tables in the Q&A later. And then we also look at whether the reformations is correlated or can be a confounder and can be a driver of our results, because we know that Protestantism increased the economic competitions between the Jewish and the Protestant population, from a recent paper by Becker and Pascali. And we also know that it has increased the non-price competition between Catholics and Protestants, and we show that our results are not confounded by these two potential channels. Then we also move a bit away from the cross-section, and we have here a repeated cross-section when we show the effect of saints on Jewish persecution and witch trials century by century. And we see that the effects it's strong over the full period, but really it's predominantly significant up to the 15th century for Jewish persecution and the 16th century for the witch trials. The relationship continues to hold, but is not always statistically significant in the following centuries. We do a bunch of robustness tests that I'm not going to be able to go through, but I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if there are questions about this. Then, of course, we are, in our main specification, we are kind of reassured by the fact that we use a pre-1100 proxy to test for post-1100 persecution. So at least we know there are no reverse causality issues here. And we have added a whole bunch of controls to ensure that our relationship is causal, but of course we cannot exclude that there can be unobservables that may lead to the endogeneity of pre-1100 cults relative to the post-1100 minority persecutions. So to deal with these potential endogeneity concerns, we use an idea approach that isolates exogenous variation in pre-1100 saints veneration, and we use the number of pre-Christianity pagan temples with the idea that location that had long established non-monotheistic beliefs were location where it was much harder, for Christianity to spread. So we collect data from these data sources and collect geocode the temple's location and collect data on these temples built between 2000 BC and 300 CE. And we use this as an instrument for pre-1100 saints. So we expect a negative sign in the first stage, and this is what we find. So the first stage is negative, so there were less saints in locations which had a strong and established pagan cult. And in terms of the IV estimates, we find them that are consistent with our OLS. They are a bit larger in magnitude for the Jewish persecution and more in line with the OLS in the case of witch trials.
1 minute left.
Oh, only 1 minute left. Okay. I'll move on quickly. So we'll then look at potential channels behind this association, behind this relationship, and we look specifically at two channels. First, we investigate whether longer exposure to Christian institution is a driver of our results. And then we look at the probability of at a mechanism that looks at coordinations between among devotees during religious festivals. So why do we care about exposure to Christian institution? There has been a set of papers recently by Heinrich and co-authors that has argued and has showed and demonstrated that exposure to Western Christianity changed the set of norms, pre-Christian norms, and also changed European psychological traits. So we really follow this literature and look at whether there is this association between church exposure and persecution, and we measure church exposure in two ways, like Heinrich et al. So with the number of centuries during which a city was bishopric. But we also can use our measure, so the number of centuries since the establishment of a saintly cult. And we find a positive relationship between them. So that's the first channel, exposure. The second channel looks at coordination. So we look at whether we have, when there were saints festivities, when they overlap with Jewish festivities, it was more likely to have increased violence because of higher religious fervor. This is a case that has been already shown in other literature. For example, in the Indian context, it has been shown that there has been more Muslim Hindu riots when religious festival occurred during the same day. So this is exactly what we want to test. And we are able to do this because Saints Festival follow the Gregorian calendar, so it's fixed over time, while Jewish festival follow the lunar calendar, so that year-to-year variation. So we measured the number of times where there was this coinciding religious festivals with the saints' festivities, and we look at the window of 5 days. Yes. So, and we find so that there is also this coordination channel also can explain this positive relationship. So I don't have any time to conclude. So we use these new saints, these saints venerations as this new proxy for religious fervor and religiosity. We've documented this positive association between religion and persecution episodes, and the two channels behind this association are the change in psychology brought by the exposure to the church, as well as the coordination during Saints Festival that led to an increase in religious fervor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have 8 minutes for questions. Who would like to start the ball rolling? would you like to end the screen share and then perhaps we can see people on the, yeah, okay. Thanks.
Mohammed, you can ask your question.
Okay, thanks, Laura, for this. So my question is, so what you're capturing here, is it the proportion of Catholics, essentially, the religious affiliation? And would we expect that after the Reformation, that with like cities converting to Protestantism, that you would observe a decline in persecutions in these cities? And can you use that? So like, so this measure, I understand you're talking about religiosity, but it's really also about the proportion of Catholics, right? Oh.
Well, given that Christianity pretty much had the monopoly over the provision of religious services, everyone was Christian, really. So since 300, when Christianity became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire and then started to spread, we can think of Christianity as a monopoly provider. So we don't have population shares of Catholics because it's pretty much the entirety of the population that was Catholic. So what we have is this whether there was a saint's veneration, whether a saint was venerated as a proxy for higher religiosity relative to a city where there was no saint being venerated. In terms of the Reformation, so one could argue that the opposite, right? That there is an increase in competition between, for example, Protestants and Jews, and therefore we could expect a higher level of persecution. And similarly with the witch trials. So what we show is that if we remove the Reformation years, so we just look at the pre-Reformation period, our results continue to hold.
Are there other questions?
Could I ask a question?
Yes, certainly. Joachim, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, brilliant work, Laura. I really like it. Let me ask you one question. So obviously you can only persecute Jews if you have any, and quite a few early modern European states specialize in just expelling them, which is not a sign of tolerance. So you have a little bit of a sort of looking for the keys under the lamppost kind of issue there. And then a lot of sort of religious persecution, in my view, and I'd be the first to admit that I'm a bit biased, is that you sort of try to ensure the purity of the faith on your own co-religionists, right? So what's the thing that we all make jokes about in terms of religious intolerance? It's the Spanish Inquisition. And while it sort of gets going initially persecuting Jews and expelling the Moriscos, 90% of what it does is basically make sure that Catholics do Catholicism exactly the right way. So I'm just sort of wondering a little bit in terms of the benefit of your paper is this very broad panorama of persecution, and you have witch hunting, you have Jews, but you seem to be missing one of these dimensions that I think is really sort of fundamental to what religious persecution is like, which is to institute a very particular type of doctrine on your co-religionists.
Yeah, so for the first part, it's true that the way in which we account for the fact that some location had Jews and others didn't, so we control for the presence of a Jewish community there. So conditional on having a Jewish community, we find that saying cities increase their persecution. So that's the best thing. Ideally, we would want to have some better measure of population, so we only use a dummy variable. Yes, no, is there a Jewish community in that place during this period? In terms of, it's true. Ideally, we would have any other data on heretical movements and heretics being persecuted. So it's true, we are just, so we can think of witches as heretics in a way. But yeah, it would be great to actually have Anabaptist numbers and how many of them were persecuted. So if I understand your question correctly, you're saying we should also look at heretics within the Christian doctrine, like Arians, for example, or Donatists, and all these splint off groups from Christianity, from Catholicism, well, what then was the Christianity, rather than just outsiders. Is that yeah? So the problem is data availability, but we are thinking about doing some case studies. So we do a case study with France, which is on a much smaller scale, and we also have data on other types of heretics, so those that don't follow the Orthodox Christian doctrine.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 questions in the Q&A box, so I think I'm going to read them out, and then we'll see how much time you've got to answer them. So the first one is from Eric Schneider, who says, following up on Mohammed, couldn't you look at various heresies as well? For instance, the Catars, Albigensians in southern France, or the Hussites in Bohemia? Second question is from Tony Moore. He asks, could the causality run in the other direction, i.e. areas with a higher population of non-Christians drove Christians to emphasize their faith by venerating local saints? And a third question from Vinit Agarwal says, Silvia Federici associates enclosure of land as the first step towards witch hunting. Can you please talk a bit more about what is the relationship of changing ownership of land with church on witch hunting? Thanks for your wonderful presentation. 3 questions there for 3.
So the first, how many minutes do I have? 1 minute?
Yeah, 1 or 2 minutes, yeah.
Yeah, so yes, I think it would be great to look at various heresies. The problem is now data availability. The best thing we now have are the Huguenots in France, and we also have some other data on non-Orthodox Christians in France. But yeah, we are working towards collecting more data. And the causality, I don't think it can go in the other direction just because we use a pre-1100 saints on post-1100 persecution. So at least I think we are not concerned with reverse causality. And then land tenure, I don't know much about. So enclosure of land as the first step of witch hunting. So I'm not too sure if there was any differential spread of property rights across cities. I mean, to the extent to which this was done at the county or region level, we have the fixed effects that could take care into this, but I didn't know about this effect of land. I will look into it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think time is up on that. So we move on to our next paper, which is being presented by Mark Goni, I guess is in Norway.
Yes.
This is of scholars in pre-industrial Europe, nepotism versus intergenerational human capital transmission.
So,
over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Do you see the screen now?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect, thanks. Thank you very much. So this is joint work with David Delacroix at Université Catholique de Leuven. And basically, if you look at across occupations, one can see several parents and children doing the same job. Okay, and academia is not an exception to this. So what we want to do in this paper is we want to evaluate why sons of scholars follow their parents into positions in early academia, and whether this held back scientific progress. Specifically, we want to disentangle the extent to which these families of scholars emerged because of the transmission of human capital, because of the abilities, human capital skills transmitted from parents to children that were then used to produce scientific output, versus how much of these families of scholars were the result of nepotism. Okay, so the fact that parents use their connections as insiders to secure jobs for their children ahead of better qualified candidates. Now, this question is motivated by growing literature that highlights the importance of upper tail human capital for Europe's early rise to riches. So that's where it has been argued that the knowledge produced at universities was essential in bringing Europe through the commercial revolution, the scientific revolution, and yet these institutions, universities, were not immune to criticism. Okay, so one common source of criticism for early universities is that they hired many relatives. The families of scholars were common. Okay, so according to our estimates, 1 in 25 scholars between 1088 and 1800 was the son of a scholar. So to put this number in perspective, think of an average department of 25 faculty members having at least one family. So to some extent, these families of scholars reflect nepotism. Okay, the faculty had a lot of leeway in deciding whom to hire, and in the primary sources that we have reviewed, we have encountered several examples of, for example, an old professor who accepts to retire from his chair under the condition that his son is appointed. Now, this kind of nepotic hiring can lead to a misallocation of talent if relatives are hired ahead of better qualified candidates. And we know from research of people like Murphy, Schleifer, and Vishny that this kind of misallocation of talent can be very harmful for the production of ideas, scientific progress, and so on. That said, of course, the fact that there were families of scholars may be optimal. Okay, so this is not only in academia. We observe family dynasties in several high talent occupations, and this may be optimal in settings where talent is scarce and where a child's human capital depends a lot on the parental investments, the human capital, the abilities, the human capital specific to the job that the child inherits from his parents. Okay, and in our primary sources, we also have evidence for this. We have several biographies that mention that the scholar's first teacher was his father, who taught him Latin or the beauty of mathematics. Okay, so if we want to evaluate whether this hiring of relatives held back scientific progress, it is crucial to disentangle these two elements. It's crucial to disentangle nepotism from inherited human capital. Now, this is challenging from an econometric perspective, and the reason is that nepotism and inherited human capital are associated to two different biases. So inherited human capital is associated with a measurement error. Okay, we really don't observe the human capital, the abilities that children inherit from their parents. We only observe outcomes like income, wealth, in our case, publications, outcomes that are correlated with this human capital, but with a noise. Okay, and recent research has shown that this bias, this measurement error bias, can be large. And if you know the work by Clark, this suggests that these intergenerational elasticities can be severely downward biased. Now, on the other hand, nepotism is associated with different sorts of bias. It's associated with a selection bias. Okay, so nepotism generates barriers of entry to an occupation, and this can bias the estimate. So if we want to disentangle these two things, we need to jointly address these two sources of bias. Today I won't be talking much about it, but by jointly addressing these two biases, our paper and the methodology that we will develop will have implications for general methods of estimating intergenerational elasticities. So what do we do in this paper to answer these questions? Well, we look at academia between the foundation of the first university in 1088 and 1800, and we build a new database of families of scholars, mostly fathers and sons employed in the same university. For each of these individuals, we measure their scientific output through their publications. So we match each individual to the WorldCat database, which is a database of modern libraries. And we basically measure the number of works by or about each author that are available in modern libraries. So this is a measure of scientific output, but it's also a measure of quality in the sense that it reflects how relevant the research produced by these individuals was for the world too. We then develop a new method to disentangle nepotism from human capital, and we apply it to this data. So the question that you all may have now is, how do we do it? How do we disentangle human capital transmission from nepotism? So let me give you some intuition. We do so by basically exploiting two sets of moments. Okay, one set of moment, which is standard in the intergenerational literature, which are father-son correlations in some observed outcomes, and then a novel set of moments. So this scatter plot illustrates this standard set of moments. It shows the correlation in publications between fathers and sons. I don't know if you can see the markers, but they name the family. So around, you can find here the Euler family, for example. And basically, in this scatter plot, we omit individuals with 0 publications, but the correlation coefficient here includes that. So what does this number tell us? Well, this number tells us that there's a very high elasticity of publications between fathers and sons. Okay, so this suggests that human capital was transmitted between parents and children at a strong. Now remember, this is biased because of a measurement error, and we will correct for this by looking at multiple generations. But what this will do basically is to increase this elasticity. Okay, so if anything, the transmission of human capital is higher than suggested by this. In other words, there is really a very slow rate of reversion to the mean in the human capital distribution. Now, to this standard moment, we add another moment, which is the copula of the distribution of publications of fathers and sons. So this is illustrated here by this quantile-quantile plot. So this is a scatter plot where every dot represents a percentile of the father's distribution plotted against the corresponding percentile in the son's distribution. So the way to interpret this is that a point here, which would be kind of the median, right? This illustrates that the median for the father is around 7 log publications, the median for the son, so the median son has 6 log publications. So you can see that all the points are below the 45 degree. Okay, so the distribution of publications of fathers first order stochastically dominates the distribution of publications of sons. Now, of course, this could be just a byproduct of reversion to the mean, right? If there is some degree of reversion to the mean, here we're looking at individuals at the top of the distribution in terms of human capital. So reversion to the mean by construction will make sons worse than the fathers. Now, we can relate these two moments through this. Okay, so if we find a very slow rate of reversion to the mean here, we would expect small distributional differences between fathers and sons. If we find a very fast rate of reversion to the mean, we will find very large distributional differences. Now, there's 2 facts that allow us to identify nepotism here. The first is that the distributional differences are concentrated at the bottom of the distribution, so close to the selection thresholds, close to these marginal levels of human capital that would determine if someone makes it into academia or not. And the second is that the rate of mean reversion that you will need to generate these distributional differences is implausibly large, especially in light of these strong father-son correlations. Okay, so basically, if you just look at the first figure, you say, wow, the rate of reversion to the mean is very slow. If you look at the second figure, you say, wow, the rate of reversion to the mean is very fast. The way we reconcile these 2 contradictory facts is by introducing nepotism. So by allowing sons of scholars to become scholars with a lower threshold of human. Okay, so basically, to sum up, what we will do is to use the excess distributional differences that are not explained by reversion to the mean to identify nepotism. So let me skip the literature review and tell you in more detail about the data. So we built a database of families of scholars, mostly fathers and sons in academia. And we start from books and catalogs of universities and scientific academies that provide us a list of all the faculty members. We then match these individuals to biographical dictionaries, and with these biographies, we identify family relationships. Okay, we identify fathers and sons. So we have found 1,200 fathers and 1,400 sons. For 150 families, we observe 3 generations or more. So here you have an example, the Shikono family. For 4 generations, they had at least a professor at the University of Montpellier. And we cover 100 universities and 40 scientific academies, 2/3 of which we have full coverage. Then, as I said, we match these individuals to the WorldCat library holdings to evaluate their publications. So here's an example of our data collection. Here it's for Honoré Biquets and his son Michel, who were both professors at the University of Aix-en-Provence. So we start with a book on the history of the university that lists both as professors there, and then we match it to a biographical dictionary. Okay, and in this biographical dictionary, it's clear that they're father and son, and it even states that the son, Michel, succeeded his father both in his chair and in his reputation. Now we want to check if this is true, so we match these individuals to the WorldCat database. Okay, so here you have on the top the entry for Honoré, the father, and at the bottom the entry for Michel. And what we focus on is the library holdings. Okay, so the number of works by or about each author that are available in libraries today. And you can see that Honoré was a prolific scholar. There's like 300 library holdings of his work, but his son Michel only has 16. So it seems like the son succeeded the father in the chair, but not so much in the reputation. So this map shows you the geographical distribution of our data. The circles are for institutions, the squares are for where the individuals in the data were born. And you can see that we have good coverage of Northwestern Europe. So we have around 30 universities in Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire. Same in France, and in Southern Europe, most of our data comes from. This shows how our data is distributed over the 800 years that we cover. Okay, so the histogram is for the number of families, and the dots is for publications. So you can see that most of our families come after 1400. And in terms of publications, there seems to be a structural break around the invention of the printing press. But at least in intensive margin, there doesn't seem to be a trend. But we will add a parameter in our model that tries to account for this type of structural break, like the one created by the printing press. Okay, so very briefly, this is the model that we estimate. We consider a standard first-order Markov process of endowments transmission with measurement error, and we expand it to include selection in the form of. Okay, so we consider an individual in the first generation that draws the human capital from a normal distribution, and then his son inherits part of his human capital at a rate beta, and then is subject to an idiosyncratic shock. So this is the inherited human capital that we want to measure. Then we don't observe human capital, but we observe publications that are made with human capital input. Okay, so publications of individuals depend on their human capital, and again, with an idiosyncratic shock. And we depart from the literature by introducing noise both in the intensive margin and in the extensive margin. So we have this parameter kappa, which is the minimum number of publications that a scholar needs in order to be observed today. which when we estimate the model at different points in time, will capture stuff like what I was saying before about the pre-inference. Okay, so this is the standard model considered in the literature. The naive father-son correlations just look at a proxy for human capital and regress the fathers on the sons. The recent estimates by people like Greg Clark take measurement error into account by looking at multiple generations, and we will do so too. But we will expand this model by incorporating nepotism. Okay, so we consider that there's a potential set of potential scholars, I, from which we only observe a selected sample. We only observe fathers and sons who are scholars. And we consider that in order to become a scholar, you need a human capital above a certain threshold, tau. And we allow for nepotism by allowing this threshold to be different for sons of scholars. So this is what will give us our nepotism. So we estimate this model using the moments that I described before. So we use father-son correlations in publications. And then we also use correlations across more than one generation to correct for measurement error. And then the second set of moments is this copula of the father-son distribution. Okay, so we consider the percentage of fathers and sons with 0 publications, the median, the 75th percentile, 95th percentile, and then. So we estimate this with a simulated method of moments. We simulate moments with our model, and we minimize the distance between the simulated and the empirical moments. So these moments here. We weight each of these differences by the standard error of the moments, and we attach additional weight to the father-son correlation and the distributional differences at the bottom, which are the things that allow us to identify our results. Okay.
Left.
Okay, thanks. So first we use this method in all of our database. Okay, so for all scholars, for all fathers and sons between 1088 and 1800, and here I'm reporting the estimated parameters. But since these numbers don't mean much, let me just guide you through them in detail. So for nepotism, in order to interpret this result, we can write it in terms of standard deviations in human capital. And we find that the son of a scholar can become a scholar with a human capital 2 standard deviations lower than the average potential scholar and than the marginal scholar. Okay, so this is not always binding, but it illustrates to some extent the level of nepotism. So what we do to give a more precise estimate is to simulate the model and set nepotism to 0. And this allows us to find that 16% of the scholar sons were nepotic scholars. So they would not have become scholars under the same criterion of their fathers. We can then replace these nepotic scholars for average scholars, and we see that the average publications in this sample would increase by 20%. So this is just for this sample, but if nepotism between fathers and sons reflect other sources of favoritism, then this is just a lower bound. In terms of inherited human capital, we find a strong elasticity of 0.6. So these families of scholars partly were determined by inherited human capital. And our estimate lies somewhat in between the naive father-son correlations that are downward biased, but and the recent estimates by people like Greg Clark that correct for measurement error but don't address separation. Okay, this is not because we look at a different setting. We apply these methods in the literature to our database, and we find the same, that our estimates are somewhat in between these two extremes.
Can you come to a close now, please?
Okay, so I'll just say this, that we estimate this for different periods, and we find that periods of rapid scientific advancement are associated with lower levels of nepotism, And then, well, just since this is a session about religion, let me say that we also compare Catholic and Protestant universities. And we find that Catholic universities, which after the Reformation stagnated and lagged behind, they also display higher levels of nepotism. So overall, this suggests that nepotism may be an important factor holding back scientific progress, but that also these families of scholars partly were explained by inherited human. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Joachim.
Yeah, so fascinating stuff. I think everybody who's ever served on a university committee can sort of relate to the underlying questions. But with something that I'm sort of trying to think about is maybe these people making the appointment decisions, they're actually not trying to maximize the mean quality of the scholar they appoint, but they have some kind of mean variance trade-off in mind, right? And even if on average the children of scholars are not as good, you may have a better sense of what you're getting along exactly the lines that you point out, because there's a bit of mean reversion. So even if, you know, the mean reversion sends you down, you're pretty sure that you're not sampling from the tail. Whereas, you know, if there's somebody that you don't know, that could be all over the map. The other thing that I was thinking about is there's a sort of Pierre Bourdieu channel of cultural capital, and you know how to hold your spoon just the right way at high table and so forth, which, you know, in some settings matters more than others. And I was wondering whether you could sort of try to get at that a little bit, because I think skill, ability, and so forth is a strong genetic element. We know that. But for the transmission of these other things, just having overlap and FaceTime with your father in this setting would matter a great deal. And you will have variation in death rates and the overlap that comes from that. So I was wondering whether you could sort of extend the model and maybe some of the empirics along the sort of, is it cognitive versus non-cognitive skills, if you want to call it that dimension.
So you're right that so far we bundle everything that is productive into this human capital. So this includes skills that are general, but also specific skills, or what maybe Bourdieu would call dinner table human capital. And some exercises that we have done that maybe relate to this is we have, for example, we have this variation, as you said, in whether the appointment happened before or after the father's death. Okay, and we exploit this variation, and well, you can see that the rate of transmission is higher in these cases. So it goes a little bit towards what you were saying. And then we also can distinguish between general and specific human capital by looking at those who were in the same field, broadly defined, as their fathers, versus those who were in a different field. Okay, and again we find that the transmission of abilities is high in both cases, but it's higher in those scholars that were in the same field, which suggests that this kind of spooning human capital or dinner table human capital may be relevant in this setting. Thanks.
Okay, we have a question from Jeremiah Dittmar, I think. Do you want to unmute yourself, Jeremiah?
Oh, yeah, sure. This is super interesting. So it's very simple, but it seems to me that it would be natural to want to compare the children of academics to their peers who weren't the children of academics. So, and I would imagine you can't. So the son of an academic versus some similarly hired cohort person who doesn't have an academic parent would be interesting. So
let me just show you this, maybe it goes into your point. So here we're exploiting individuals who we haven't matched as fathers and sons. Okay, so this is a QQ plot of basically fathers, sons versus outsiders, okay, versus individuals we have not matched. And what you can see here is that sons of scholars are also, on average or on aggregate, worse than the outsiders, whereas fathers are a little bit better. Okay? And this is also suggestive of nepotism, in the sense that there seems to be a clear difference. Now, to use this in the estimation is a little bit more complicated, because this comes from a different sample, and selection into this sample is different. But I agree with you that this is a nice comparison.
Okay, I have two questions in the Q&A box. We still have a few minutes. So first one is from Vinit Agarwal. What if we try mapping this on women scholars and the matrilineal lineages inside academies? And how reliable is log publication as a measure of both academic privilege and academic success? Do you want to have a go at answering that?
So first, I think that the first question is fascinating. Maybe not so much for our setting, because sadly there was very few women in academia in the early days. But I think this methodology that we developed here can be used in more modern settings to also evaluate these questions. And regarding the measure, the publications, I agree that publications, it's not always a measure of scientific output. But as I said here, we're looking at library holdings today of the works that these guys did in the past. So in a sense, it's a measure of quality, because it tells us how relevant this stuff is for the world today. Okay. Whereas if we were using just the number of publications at the time, that would reflect more privilege, or, for example, connections that allow you to publish your work more easily, even if it's not of scientific relevance.
Okay, two more questions from the Q&A box. Firstly, from Peter Solar, we have, you observe only the sons who became scholars. How might the numbers of sons who did not become scholars influence your results concerning nepotism? And from Eric Schneider, we have, I wonder if you could use the arrival of early modern plagues in certain cities as exogenous shocks to human capital. You have 1 minute.
So, very briefly, for the first question, unfortunately, we don't really observe these individuals, so there's little we can do with them. We are now collecting data on brothers that are in academia, even if their father is not. So there we will also be able to do something interesting. And thanks for the suggestion of Eric. I think now we're getting to a size of the database that allows us to do heterogeneity more at the local level, and that maybe we can explore these sources of variation. But so far we haven't done it because the data set was not large enough to split it too much. But, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think we've come to the end of the time for this paper, so let's move on. Next speaker is Cédric Chambrou from Zurich. His paper is Was Louis XIV Wrong? Socioeconomic Consequences of Protestantism in Early Modern France. Over to you, Cédric.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my screen? It's all good?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, that's perfect. So, hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I will present my research on the diffusion of Protestantism and the effect of the Revocation in late 17th France on various socioeconomic outcomes, with the focus mostly on the human capital aspect for today's presentation. So we know that religious denominations are crucially important to understand cultural trait and socioeconomic value at the individual, but also at the society level, and it contributes to shape behavior that can have some significant impact on economic development. In the specific case we are interested in today, the Protestant Reformation, we have some empirical evidence suggesting that it may have contributed to the wave of economic growth in Europe after the 16th century. So while there is already a large literature on the spread and these socioeconomic consequences of Reformation in Europe, one of the drawbacks of this literature is also that it focuses mostly on one single area, which is the Holy Roman Empire. So what I do in today's paper basically is to expand this research by focusing on France and asking how and whether Protestantism fosters the development of upper tail and lower tail human capital in France. And I further try to understand how the revocation, which is the end of Protestantism in the late 17th century, could have affected these relationships. So these papers relate to various streams of the literature, the main one being the literature addressing these consequences of the Reformation with a specific focus on the level of human capital. So we have some empirical evidence suggesting that it is positively correlated. However, some recent papers, in particular by Costin and co-authors, suggest that these early findings on the validity of the Weber hypothesis are wrong, and that more than religious group, what matters to understand the level of human capital in 19th century Prussia are the differences between ethnic groups. So it's not that Protestants are more literate than Catholic, but more than German-speaking individuals are more literate than Polish. So this is this evidence between this Weber hypothesis is maybe not so clear-cut. So what would be the main contribution of this paper? So first, it is to bring forward a new data set at the city level on both the diffusion of Protestantism and the level of human capital at the for upper tail and lower tail level of human capital at the city level, as well as some data set at the department level. So what I show first is that Protestantism is indeed in France positively associated with higher level of male literacy in the late 17th and late 18th century. However, this association is much weaker with female literacy rate, which in turn contributed to the widening of the literacy gender gap during this 18th century. Second, I show that this effect is quite heterogeneous across France, and in particular, area where the revocation had stronger effect, with the departures of thousands and thousands of Huguenots to Switzerland, Prussia, and the UK. This effect of Protestantism was much smaller than in areas that were less affected. In the papers, I also study the effect on various aspects of economic development, in particular population growth and a diffusion of textile industry. And I find that it has a little effect on the population growth in the 18th century, and if anything, was positively correlated with the diffusion of textile industry in 1708, so early 18th century. But I think due to time constraint, I'm not going to talk about this today. So just a few words about the historical background before moving to the data and the empirical strategy I used. So early in the 16th century, you already have some main characters in the Catholic Church emphasizing the necessity to reform the church and bring it back to its primitive purity. And soon after the first wave of persecution against these individuals and the first Protestant in France started. However, within 50 years, despite this persecution, there were about 10% of the French population, this is 2 million individuals, that have shifted their face to Protestantism and mostly Calvinism, so very few Lutheran in France. However, during the next half century, so between 60 and the late 16th century, 8 waves of religion occurred, resulting in thousands of deaths and also in a lot of persecution against Protestantism, which considerably reduced their number. So by the time Henry IV enacted the Edict of Nantes, granting the freedom of worship to Protestantism, we estimate that there were about 1 million Protestants in France left. So half about what was 50 years ago. And for about a century, these 500,000 Protestants live in relative peace with Catholic counterpart until Louis XIV decided to revoke the Edict of Nantes and forbade Protestantism in 1685. At the time, about 200,000 of these Huguenots decided to flee abroad, mostly Switzerland, Prussia, and the Netherlands and in England, and which means that about 8,000, 700,000, 800,000 decided to stay in France. Okay, so this is about 20% of the stock of Protestants leaving France, about 80% staying in France. While this number is pretty small in comparison to the total French population, it is nonetheless a significant population shock for many areas and cities where Protestants concentrated. So, for instance, various estimates suggest that important cities such as Metz and Nice lost at least 15% of their population. Other more like rural areas such as Vivarais, so this is south of Lyon, lost maybe 7 to 10% of their population, which is within like few years, which is so a significant population shock. Another important aspect of this revocation is that beyond forbidding the exercise of the Protestant faith, Louis XIV also enacted several royal edicts, making sure that Protestants actually turned to Catholicism and tried to re-educate Protestants and their children in the Catholic faith. So to do this, what they implement is they try to open as many schools as possible in this Protestant area to educate, indoctrinate Protestant children in the Catholic faith. So, and we have several examples of these types of edict. And what is the outcome of this is that we see many schools actually opening in the 18th century, with the result that by the end of the 18th century, in many parishes, you have at least one school. So this is an extreme case in the Diocese of Toul in eastern France, where by the time of the French Revolution, every parish is having at least one school. Of course, this is different in different regions, but this is to give you an idea that of the effect of these measures. So what data am I using to address this specific question? So on the right-hand side, I collect data on the diffusion of Protestantism in the late 17th century, 16th century and 17th century at the department level. So this is well-known data from Samuel Moore's research. I also collect some data at the city level on the number of Protestant pastors in 1660. So this is 20 years before the revocation. And you can see from this data that compared to the first map, there is way less Protestants than a century before, but we still have a high concentration of Protestants in some area, in particular in South and some parts of Western France. I also collect other measures of Protestantism, such as the share of population per department or the number of register of consistory of Reformed Church across France, just to make sure that I don't have too much bias in one of my measures. One important data set that I'm relying on is the number of Huguenot refugees after the revocation, and I derive this data from an online website on the refuge that allow me to collect information on the place of origin of 60,000 Huguenot refugees. So helping me to map the effect of the population shock of this revocation at the local level. And this is what you get when you map this data. So you can see that a lot of area close to the Swiss border are dark blue, where a lot of Protestants and local decided to flee France, whereas still in the western side of France, where it was maybe more difficult to find your way abroad, you have a lower number of people actually living in France. And of course, in areas such as Brittany, where you get very few Protestants on the west side, it's very yellow, so very few people actually left France. So this revocation really have a differential effect in terms of population shock across various areas in France, both between Catholic and Protestant area, but also within this Catholic Protestant area. And as my left-hand side variables, I will collect a various set of information on human capital. So first, I used data on male literacy rate in late 17th century and 18th century from Maggiolo, which are like already well known and used by, for instance, by Cicciani and Freutlander on the paper. But I also developed collect a new data set on male and female literacy rate at the town level for the late 19th century, covering about 900 French towns. So this is about 10 towns per department. And overall, this is about 2% of the universe of French towns. So this is a small number, but I mean, this is time consuming to collect. And as for the proxy for upper tail level of human capital, I'm using the information on the member of knowledge societies in France between the mid-17th and 18th century. So this member of knowledge society were scholars interested in the development and diffusion of knowledge related to progress in these various sectors, including agriculture and industries. So, and of course, but I also collect some data on the socioeconomic outcome, including the number of textile industry at the town level in early 18th century, but I'm skipping this for today. So moving to the empirical strategy, I rely on a relatively straightforward and simple cross-section model where I estimate my main variable of interest would be the level of literacy rate at the department or city level in a given year. And I will explain this by my proxy for the diffusion of Protestantism that I label Huguenot at the department or city level in a given year. And I, of course, had a set of control variables, socioeconomic geographic variables to take into account different factors that could also have an impact on this relationship. So all the standard errors are clustered at the department level. And I also rely on only standard errors just to make sure that spatial autocorrelation does not drive this relationship, but it does not affect any of my results. So moving to the results, what do we see? So what I find is that on average, Protestantism is positively associated with the level of lower tail human capital, both in the late 17th and late 18th century. So this is what you can see from column 1 and 2. And on average, the coefficients mean that increasing the Protestant Huguenot population in your total population by 1 percentage point resulted in an increase in the male literacy rate by about 2%, both in the late 17th and 18th century. Now, moving to column 3, you can see that this effect is different depending on whether you are focusing on a department where you had a strong wave of Huguenot refugee after 1685, or you had no or little Huguenot refugee after 65, and you see that the areas which were mostly affected by this population shock display lower level of human capital in the late 18th century. Now, if you focus at the growth of human capital, lower tail human capital between these two periods, you can see that area where you had Huguenot had higher growth of level of human capital during this period. So this is a question from column 4, and I think this coefficient is in line with the historical evidence showing that the monarchy had really put some lot of effort to open schools in area where you had a lot of Huguenot population to make sure that these Huguenot kids were actually educated in Catholic manners. So they were trained by local priests to read and write, and just to make sure that they do not go to the Catholic to the Protestant faith, but remain in this Catholic faith. Now, moving to the estimate at the city level, this is very much similar. So from column 1 to 3, I display different estimates for various proxy of the diffusion of Protestantism. So whether the number of pastor, temple, or registry. And you can see that, again, it's always positively associated with the level of human capital in the late 17th century, and the magnitude is quite similar with what we've seen at the city level. Column 4 indicates that, again, cities that were mostly affected by this population shock created by the revocation are also lower level of male literacy rate in the late 18th century. in column 5, I'll try to have a quick look at the effect of the Counter-Reformation, and in particular to the effort of the Jesuits to fight against Protestantism, and I look at whether or not the fact to have a Jesuit college in your city have an effect on your level of human capital. And I can see that, of course, where Jesuit college invest in where Jesuit invest in opening a college and invest in education, it also had some positive effect on the level of human capital, which I think is not surprising overall. Moving to the question of gender gap and female literacy rate. So in column 1 and 2, I display the relationship between the diffusion of Protestantism and female literacy rate at the department level, this is column 1, and city level in column 2. And I find that overall, the association is relatively weak in the first case and positive but non-significant in the second case, suggesting that for relatively surprisingly, Protestant had a positive effect of the level of human capital on male, but not on female. This fact resulted in a widening of the gender gap literacy rate during the 17th century. So in column 3 and 4, I estimate the effect of Protestantism on the difference in terms of level between literacy rate of male and literacy rate of female. And what I find is that adding one pastor in the 1660s, so this is before revocation, is associated with a 1 to 6% increased literacy gender gap between male and female in the late 17th century. So again, having a strong impact on this gender aspect. Now, moving to the second aspect of the human capital and focusing on this more elite knowledge. So first, what I do is that I investigate the relationship between Protestantism and the number of scholars in a given department in 1700, and I found that Protestantism is indeed associated with a higher level of higher number of scholars per 1,000 inhabitants, no matter which proxy for Protestantism I'm using. However, if I moved from cross-section to a dynamic analysis and doing a event studies types analysis, what I find is that the revocation had actually a negative, significant and negative impact on the numbers of scholars in knowledge society from the 18th century onward. So you can see that from 1720, the effect is negative and significant, suggesting that department where you had a high number of Huguenots deciding to flee to Switzerland or Prussia also displayed a lower number of scholars compared to other departments. The revocation really had a significant impact on the diffusion of upper tail human capital in France in the 18th century. And this is, I think, an important finding because we know from Schicchirani and Poetlander that this upper tail human capital was central to the economic development of France later on during the 19th century.
Cedric, time is moving on. You've got 1 minute left.
Yes, that's perfect. I'm moving to the conclusion. So this is quite important because this revocation could have a, maybe in the long run, have a significant negative impact on the level of economic development across France. So just to sum up what I've tell you today, so I've shown that Protestantism is positively associated with higher level of human capital. So on average, increasing the share of Huguenot by 1 percentage point in the population is associated with a 2% increase in the male literacy rate, consistent with the Weber hypothesis. I found that this effect is stronger in area where Protestant did not fled, there is a typo here, did not fled after the revocation. So where the population happened, the effect was smaller. And I also provide some tentative evidence showing that the revocation had a negative impact on both lower and upper tail human capital, which could have a significant negative economic impact in the long run. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward for your questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Any questions from the panelists first? Can I persuade anyone to ask a question? No. Well, Cedric, we have a few minutes left if you want to add something to what you said.
Yes, I can maybe, let me share, maybe just show you something. Yes, and maybe as for the effect on population growth, maybe not very surprisingly, I just find that as in the Morisco's case, to find a significant effect on the growth of urban population in this area where you had a higher population shock. So this is the 70, 70, 50, but once this area has catch up in terms of demography, you don't see any more effect on this population after 70, 50. So once you return to your mean and level of population, the effect, negative effect of the eradication of the population is completely ruled out. And as I mentioned earlier, you find this positive effect between the diffusion of industries, textile industry and Huguenot in the 18th century, and it seems that the eradication did not have any effect on this. This historical form did not have any effect on this industry. So it did not hamper, at least in the very short run, this economic development of France in terms of textile industry. And yes, I think that's pretty much all what I can have.
Okay, we have some questions coming in.
That's good.
So,
that's good.
We have a question from Mark Spurrer, who says, I wonder whether there is data on the economic outcome per county so that you could relate Protestantism to economic growth. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, so in terms of GDP, the first measures are available for the second half of the 19th century. So I think it's a bit late on. And for other types of economic outcomes, the only data available I could find was this survey of textile industry in the early 18th century. In late 18th century, you have some data, but it's at the regional level, like 32 region. So my fear is that the sample is a bit too small.
Okay, we have another question from Mark Koyama. Says the impact on city growth, one might expect it to be negative in the longer run into the 19th century, as the Huguenots were skilled rather than the Muslims in Spain who were unskilled.
Yes, so as I showed briefly on the figures, I mean, I stopped at the end of the 18th century, but I could easily add some data on population growth in 19th century, and to see if we have a difference from 1800 onwards. This is a good point. Yes.
Okay, well, I think that's all the questions. No, I'll see more coming in. Vinit Agarwal writes, thanks for your presentation. I wanted to ask you about the idea of religious refugees as human capital shock. I would like to ask you about the relationship of that with family relations vis-a-vis the textile trade, but also the triangular slave trade that the textile trade would have caused. Do we have any data that takes us there? Thanks for accommodating rather a not very specific question.
So we don't have exhaustive data on this. We have some local history suggesting that you have a strong network ties being set up between Protestants that stay in France and who moved, for instance, in Switzerland and Prussia. So we have some historical evidence on this, but it's hard to build the full network of Protestant family tie, unfortunately. But we have some historical evidence showing that this was actually the case, and that it helps to foster exchange between these different areas.
Okay, we have another question from Tianyi Wang. He says, I'm wondering whether the effect on literacy may translate into interest in politics and political participation. Wondering whether there may be data on newspapers or election turnout.
There could be. So yes, that's an interesting point. So the first election that are actually occurring in France is happening in 1848. So this is pretty late compared to my data. As for newspaper, I'm not aware of any data set available for the 18th century. And for the 19th century, there is some data, but again, it's quite late, like 1880. But I can look at it in a long run perspective, at least for this. Yes, this is a good point. I can do more long run analysis. Thanks.
Okay, I think we've exhausted all the questions now. So time for a coffee break, and we'll be coming back at 4 o'clock for a session on human capital and exploitation, which will be chaired by Martina Vierengo. So you have a little over 20 minutes for coffee break. I'll see you later.
Okay, I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on human capital and exploitation. My name is Martina Viarengo. I'm a professor at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. We have 3 presentations this afternoon. Before we start, very quickly, let me remind you that we have 30 minutes per paper. Presentations will last 20 minutes, and we will devote the last 10 minutes to questions and discussion. So I encourage participants to keep their questions for the end. You can either raise your electronic hand using the raise hand button or use the chat. I will collect questions from the chat during the presentation and then share them with the speakers. Please keep your questions and answers short, as we only have 10 minutes for the Q&A. Our first presenter is Jeremiah Dietmar. Jeremiah is Associate Professor in the Economics Department at the London School of Economics. Today, he will present his study on the role of universities in knowledge production and industrial change in 19th century Germany. Jeremiah, you have 20 minutes. The virtual floor is yours.
Great. So Rolf and I are very grateful to be included. So thank everyone. So this paper is concerned with the role of the university, and in particular, the research university, in the transition to growth. There's a large literature suggesting that in the English Industrial Revolution, universities played at best a limited role. But certainly the classics, including David Landis, have suggested that universities could provide a means for somewhat following economies to catch up. So what we do in this study is we turn to German history as both an example and a source of a potential model. And the motivating stylized fact is that in the 19th century, Germany both industrializes and develops what we would today consider the modern research university. So university defined by the combination of teaching and research, and with one of its central objectives being the expansion of the body of knowledge that we have. So to understand this process, and even more broadly to think about German industrialization, like a key challenge is that the available evidence before the middle 1800s are fragmentary. So what we do in this paper is, we offer a historical narrative, which I would sort of gloss as a set of political and cultural changes precipitated by and beginning with the French Revolution, but also bleeding into the Napoleonic invasions of Germany, shifted what an economist could conceive of as the supply and demand for knowledge. We're then going to gather and show to you new, rather disaggregated evidence on manufacturing and on invention before and after these changes. And what we'll show you today is that following the shifts that we're going to suggest occurred in the universities in the early 1800s, we see an acceleration in both invention and manufacturing and a spatial shift towards universities. So you could sort of situate our story in a larger literature on how Central Europe became an advanced and relatively wealthy part of the world. So the canonical story would be there was a growth spurt in the middle 1800s, going back to Gerschenkron and others. Now, of course, that story is queried and contested. There are scholars who argue for a more continuous process. There's scholars who emphasize other factors that shaped post-1850 growth. And there are scholars who suggest that, in fact, there were important changes in the early 1800s, which in timing is in keeping with the story that we're going to tell from a slightly different vantage point. So at the core of what we do is that we assemble and analyze evidence on invention and science from the technology and history of science literature. And I'll show you this, but the key advantage here is that this is individual level evidence on breakthroughs. It covers periods before the sort of serious establishment of patent systems. And notably, it covers both things that were patented and things that weren't. We'll combine that with evidence on the pattern of manufacturing from an encyclopedia of German cities. And like, if you were to step back and sort of think sort of empirically and conceptually, like one of the things that we're hoping to contribute to and engage on is this question of where do we actually look when we're trying to think through processes of historical development and innovation? What sorts of data could we indeed assemble? So I'm going to give you the paper in essentially 3 slides. So we assembled this evidence on scientific discovery and invention, and we locate these across 2,000 cities and towns in historical Germany. And as a first sort of exercise, we cut the data between towns that are close to and far from universities. And what you see is that in the early 1800s, there's this sort of bifurcation. There's an overall increase in the flow of such inventions and breakthroughs, but clearly something differential is going on in towns closer to universities. And this already sort of imposes some discipline on your thinking. Like if you think that the railroad is the key driver, if you think that the customs union is the key driver, we're identifying, at least in the data that we've collected, some interesting pivot at an earlier moment in history, which sort of invites natural questions. If you read Kuznets, or if you're thinking through the lens of Paul Romer's work, if innovation is central for growth, how might this or might this not connect with the sort of classical patterns of industrial development in this era? So when we turn to think about industrial development, we look at the pattern of plant openings or factory presences across a couple thousand cities in Germany. And so these are the cities that we're looking at, and we're effectively, at its core, going to simply ask, when do we see these types of events differentially shifting towards university cities? And this is, in advance of estimation, the crux of our story, that in the late 1700s, we don't see any advantages in terms of manufacturing in those cities that are relatively close to universities as against those are relatively far. And after 1800, we see a shared increase, but differentially so in the cities that are close to universities. And just to like fix ideas, the cutoff here between close and far is the median, and it's about 60 kilometers. Okay, so if you're to think through the geography of this process. Now, in the time period that we study, there are remarkable changes like in politics, in culture, and sort of we flag for you notably in and around German universities, which had declining enrollments in the late 1700s, which were in many ways not on the up and up, and were reconceptualized in terms of a new notion of scientific education, and like that's the translation, that becomes like a prominent part of German culture. And then ultimately, although we're not going to talk about this, the German research university model, as I mean, many people know, is exported to other countries. You know, it comes to Johns Hopkins and Cornell in the United States, and then prompts a response by the incumbent American universities, which previously did not frame their endeavors in this way. So we want to suggest to you, and I guess I gloss through this in brutal simplicity in 20 minutes, that the French Revolution and the Napoleonic invasions were key events prompting a sequence of changes in how universities operated in Germany. That this is something that we can trace to some extent at the universities themselves, to some extent in the realm of sort of high theory among German intellectual elites. So to put some bones on this, here is a highly selective but illustrative list of interesting changes in and around universities in Germany. And like, I'm just going to flag a couple things here. So first, there are a number of important changes that precede the foundation of the University of Berlin. So if the first conception is the University of Berlin is truly the event, we're going to argue to you that actually a set of changes are underway prior to the foundation of the University of Berlin. The second thing I'll flag is things like this 1802 Physical Mechanical Institute at Jena were explicitly designed as extramural research institutes in which professors and mechanics would collaborate and in which invention would be commercialized. So the German historical literature frames this as at least potentially an analog to mechanics institutes in the UK, for those of you who have that as your framing. So if you look at say, Google Books, and you search for the German language analog to scientific, you see in our period it taking off. And then with potentially a slight lag in the early-ish 1800s, you see the number of students enrolled at German universities also increasing. So this is time series evidence that sort of animates our sort of panel and more cross-sectional look at the data. So we look at the Deutsches Städtebuch, which is an encyclopedia of towns, and we use it to code up at the town by time by sector level the types of manufacturing activities that are there. And so this gives you at least like a preliminary vision of essentially what I was showing you in the map just a moment ago. So what we'll do with this evidence, a few things, but to begin with, just this exercise of when do we see towns closer to universities differentially emerging as manufacturing hubs. And so you have all your natural questions about untangling cause and effect. Like, what is really behind the location of the universities? Yes, some of them are historical, but some of them are founded in your period. What about other changes, your so-called time-varying unobservables, territorial free enterprise laws, the coming of the railroads, and so on? So to begin with, let me just plot for you estimates that look at whether being close in a binary sense to a university is associated with manufacturing advantages. And here I'm doing that two different ways. One using a time invariant measure of proximity defined ex ante in the 1780s, and one in potentially endogenous ex post measure of proximity. And the sort of submission here is just looking at this as an exercise, thinking about the variation in the evidence that we've assembled after the after 1800, before 1840, before the railroad, we see what seems like an increase in manufacturing closer to universities. Like that again is our core finding in a regression with fixed effects and so on. Okay, so there's lots of interpretive questions that you would have. Other forms of institutional changes, whether it's the Napoleonic ones that are in your mind or Prussian reforms. Is this effect really observed locally? Like when we compare two cities within Baden or two cities within Saxony in the same time period. So this table walks you through in a very preliminary way some of the comparisons that we present. So like the first column is our baseline comparison where we see, you know, a significant uptick in manufacturing in places close to universities. The second column walks you through comparisons that are, as I sort of just alluded to, towns in the same territory, of which there are 44 in our data, and in the same period, do we see those towns closer to universities differentially developing manufacturing? We then see in columns 3 and 4 that the effects are sort of more pronounced in the eastern edges of Prussia than the western edges of Prussia, or the sort of Rhineland part of historical Prussia. That's at least possibly consistent with the Landis vision of the university having differential positive effects in more backwards locations. And I guess if you were to skate all the way to the 7th column, you know, we basically restrict ourselves to thinking about time periods before the advent of rail. And in this time period, our measure of proximity to universities like strongly predicts new types of manufacturing activities, and much more weakly do we see the so-called free enterprise laws. And if you wish, that's like a comparison to the paper by Acemoglu, Davide, Cantoni, and others, where they think about quote unquote institutional change driving German economic development in the 19th century. Okay, so there are of course other things that are happening, right? Including competing and potentially endogenous other things. And I'll sort of talk through a couple of them, but one is other forms of educational innovation, which happen later, like they really roll in after 1820. So we're seeing effects around universities before these other things. Another thing you might ask us is, okay, you've shown that being close in a 1-0 sense predicts economic development, but can you trace the role of geography in a more continuous way? And this, in effect, does that. This is estimates from a similar regression, but instead of the treatment being in the post-period close, it's the post-period by different levels of distance. Okay, so I think I have like maybe 5 minutes. So let me quickly talk about invention. So what we do to think about knowledge production and invention is we look at major inventions and discoveries from a classic work in the history of science and technology. And what this work does is it describes individual breakthroughs and inventions, and it identifies who the inventors were. So to be clear, this is not the sort of unknown small mechanic that Joel Mokyr and Rolf's prior work deals with. These are people who are sufficiently renowned that we have something about who they were in the historical record. And what we in this sense is a much more collective we with a large number of German graduate students do, is we go and trace where these people lived, where they were located when they were inventing, what their education was, and where they were employed, including are they employed at a university. So we assign inventors to their biographic data, and our data have things such as this potentially interesting example of a hydraulic lift. I mean, amazing historical stuff. So what I want to suggest to you in the time that remains are just a few basic facts. So the first is we can cut our data between what we would call basic science and applied invention. And we see both going up. It's not the case that towns near universities only are producing pure science. They're producing both basic science and practical inventions. It's also the case that people who are inventors differentially are employed by universities after 1800. So like if we go to their biographies, actually these people have university employment as part of their occupational profile. We also turn to other sources of innovation like Petra Moser's Crystal Palace sort of inspired evidence. So we can look at which German cities actually have exhibits in the Crystal Palace. And what we find is that towns close to the universities do have weekly more exhibits. But when we separate those exhibits between the ones that received awards at the Crystal Palace, which we call high quality, and the ones that didn't receive awards, what universities predict are high quality award-winning exhibits of industrial invention in the Crystal Palace catalog that Petra has sort of introduced us to. The last thing I want to suggest is that we could also think about the pattern of invention and manufacturing exploiting the differences across industries in both proximity of manufacturing plants to universities and the intensity with which a given industry like textiles or chemicals is itself using inventions in our data. Okay, so we classify the inventions as essentially inputs into different industries. And what we find, and this is not clearly cause and effect, we're just sort of tracing a correlation, is that industries that more intensively have inventions associated with university inventors, that's the horizontal axis, are the ones that are differentially in the post-1800 period locating closer to universities. Okay. So this is just one more piece of evidence. So I think I'm almost at the end. And so let me—
We have 2 minutes left.
Okay, great. So like I would say I'll take my last 2 minutes to slow down and suggest conceivably some larger economics takeaways. So the first is that we would suggest that the example of universities in Germany is just a tremendously interesting and possibly canonical example of how higher education can play a role in catch-up, and in particular in changing what an economist would think of as the knowledge production function. This particular setting also invites you to reconsider like how you would even define science as an economist. So the way science was understood in this moment was not the way we understand it today when we think of like STEM subjects. It was a broader and more sort of comprehensive notion of disciplined inquiry. So that's potentially quite interesting. The second point is just, as against an existing literature, on the margins in which we've collected evidence, we find that industrialization occurs earlier and differently than commonly assumed. So in the early 1800s, not in a big spurt after 1850, and spatially around universities. And this gives me my window to say, and this is consistent with these extraordinary scholars from the former East Germany. The third point is that in some ways, we are telling a story that is cropped to an era of success and growth. Like this could be a companion piece to Fabian Waldinger's work on what happened to German science during the period when fascism came to the fore. So we have a setting in which a sequence of political and cultural changes triggered a shift in knowledge production. But if you take a larger perspective and think of Fabian and others' work, the larger historical perspective equally points to potentially, anyways, the fragility of science-based growth and the larger sort of social settings in which these processes take place. So I leave it there. And again, thank you so much for including us.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Perfect timing. Perhaps can you stop sharing your screen so I can see the panelists? The floor is now open for questions. Perhaps let me start then with the first one. I think it's really fascinating. I was wondering what was the role of the development of clusters of universities and technical schools? Was a critical mass of researchers and scientists in close by universities what really led to the promotion of technologies adopted in manufacturing? Do you find any threshold effects? And do you observe any network effects and externalities related to the production of knowledge and the promotion of local economic development?
Okay, so we haven't done the things that implicitly you are possibly suggesting that we do. So we haven't looked at networks. Our principal showing has been in and around universities, a university, do we see more economic development, but we have not exploited potential added effects where there are multiple universities with potentially overlapping sort of spillovers. Like that's an interesting possibility that we have not yet explored. In terms of critical masses, that's actually really challenging, I would say, for us to document because evidence on the number of researchers in some sense is hard to classify precisely over our period. So one of the interesting things in our period is that you see the development of institutes and seminars, like the infrastructure that we all recognize develops at this time in Germany, but largely is formalized, especially in the 1820s and 1830s. So that's when it starts to get observed as line items on university budgets. So in the prior period, it's much harder to trace. And that list of sort of events that I gave you at the beginning, like those institutes, those are before they go on the university budget. And so the records there are much more fragmentary. So like, well, we can certainly think about this, but you're just asking us challenging questions I can't answer yet. So next question.
Okay, thank you. Steve, over to you.
Okay, Mohammed.
Steve, I think first, and then Mohammed.
I see.
Steve, you can unmute yourself.
Sorry, I think Mohammed was next, so you're looking ahead of me. Mohammed, please go ahead.
Okay, Mohammed.
Okay, thanks, Jeremiah. That was great. So I have two questions. The first is the content of the technological innovation in this period. Like I would have imagined that you would expect universities to have an impact during the second industrial revolution, so like a bit later in the 19th century. So I was wondering, like, why do you observe this bigger effect in the first industrial revolution? And the second question is about funding. Like, you can imagine, like, these universities need funding, of course, and were they like state funded? Who put the resources to attract these inventors? And did they vary also in size, I would imagine? So maybe you can have some measure of that instead of treating them equally.
Yeah, so I think we think that one of the interesting aspects of our findings are that we find specifically practical inventions closer to universities in the first half of the 1800s. So I think a conventional view would be that the Landis view is that universities have their payoff in the second half of the 1800s with the development of the chemicals industries and so on, right? And we're finding that universities are associated not principally with chemicals technologies, but with a range of applied technologies starting in earlier timeframes. So in our data, that is what we find. And the mix of industries that we see in the earlier period is slightly different. Textiles industries are larger. Chemical industries are smaller, although they already matter. The universities are state funded and receive monies principally from the state, to some extent from some old sort of grants and real estate portfolios. So we are not in a position, sadly, to document as yet to document university budgets in the early timeframes. Arguably, another possibly interesting piece of evidence is that even into the 1830s, when we have evidence on university institute budgets, the budgets are quite small. They are doing a lot with relatively modest sums. And so maybe I should show you that picture. I think it sort of is amazing actually how much intellectual sort of contribution was done relatively cheaply, but like I should offer you the precise figures, like how many per capita incomes were devoted to the Mechanical Institute at Jena, like that sort of stuff. So I hope I've answered your questions. Yeah. Steve.
Yeah, well, my questions are pretty much along the same lines, really. It's about the relationship between the rise of the German university and industrial performance. It still seems to me that there is a big lag here between the period of conventional dating of German industrial competitiveness, beginning to export and so on. So there's a very long lag. But then also at the other end, you get to the 1930s and the Nazis kind of clear out all the great scientists. But German industry does very well after World War II again. It seems to me maybe the sort of kind of science being done in the universities is not so important for industrial performance.
Okay, so
well, you're exaggerating the role of pure science in. One thing I was kind of intrigued by was.
So, okay, wait. So then you want some other channel. So you think really the universities are driving what Rolf and Jeremiah observed through some cultural channel. It's not actually science. I mean, maybe that's possible.
I thought when you split the science between pure science and applied science, that we'd see a lag there between the pure science and then around about 1860, 1870 or whatever, you'd have the applied science, but they all seem to turn up at the same time. So maybe it's saying that the reasons for the strong German industrial performance have less to do with science in universities than the technical colleges, the technical training and so on. I don't know. That's sort of the way I would look at it.
So fair enough. So, I mean, if your benchmark is high productivity in export industries, yeah, the weight of evidence goes to the later period. But like, if you allow us to invoke Tilly is like, the great spurt theory is based on focusing selectively on certain sectors and not looking at sectors in which people haven't had evidence. And all we are saying, like, we actually think of this, I hope, I mean, Rolf somehow is not allowed to ventriloquize for me, but is that like along these margins on which we have data, we certainly are seeing industrial invention early on, and we certainly are seeing industrial plants. Now they're small and their ability to export is limited and their competitiveness is limited. but they certainly are growing. And then they predict, like I haven't shown you this, but they predict where the railroads are going to go. And they predict many of the things that occur in the second half of the 19th century, where like obviously the full flowering of a number of these industries is observed.
Okay, great. We have time for a last question. We have a question from Kevin O'Rourke. Kevin, the floor is yours.
I saw Kevin in the attendees. Is he not?
Oh, yeah. So perhaps you, yes, can you type your question?
Open questions. Okay. What about okay, Chris Meisner. We take Germany as a unit of analysis. Totally fair enough. We have taken Germany as our unit of analysis. We've focused us on German dynamics. We think they're interesting. Our data are German, but like I actually have some interest in expanding this to pan-European stuff. Anonymous says, what about reverse causality? I completely take this point. So the last picture showed that invention and manufacturing in the same sorts of areas are clustering together, but it's entirely possible that some of that invention is induced by the growth of the manufacturing sector. It's very hard to untangle this cleanly. Should I go through the last two questions?
I think we need to wrap up because time is up. Thank you very much, Jeremiah. We have to now continue with our next speaker, Joachim Wolf. Joachim is a professor of economics at University of Zurich and affiliated professor at the UBS Center. Today, he will present his work on the role of slavery in the British Industrial Revolution and on the effects on economic development. Joachim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martina. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for including us in the program. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you see my slides?
No, not yet.
Okay, so let's see if this works.
You started sharing your screen, but okay, perfect now.
Yep. Let me just make sure that I can get to my Zoom screens. Otherwise, it's a little bit hard to know where we're at. Okay, so what's this paper about? What we want to answer is the question whether today's riches of developed countries were in part built on the profits from slavery. Now, this is a very old question, and Adam Smith already had things to say about this, and he was mostly skeptical about this notion. And almost 100 years ago, Eric Williams argued that British industrial development owed a great deal to slave trading profits. So what Steve Redding and I want to do in this paper is to open this question and think about it from a slightly different angle, and to preview the argument and results. We're going to argue that slavery makes a big difference to industrialization, that it accelerates the pace of industrialization, and it does so for reasons that haven't really been highlighted in this literature to a great extent. What we're going to argue is that what makes a difference is not the slave trade, but slave holding, the enslavement and exploitation of them in the Caribbean by British slaveholders, generating profits that then, when slavery is abolished, become liquid cash and facilitate economic development. That's where we want to go with this paper. So let me walk you through the different steps of this argument. Okay, so I've talked about this. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you evidence on geographical variation in the participation in slave holding within Britain. That comes from a unique data source based on the compensation paid to British slaveholders when slavery is abolished by an act of parliament in 1833. And what we then have is a model, which I won't impose on you given the brevity of time, but we will show you based on highly disaggregated geographical data that wherever in Britain compensation payments for slavery were high, you get a big jump in manufacturing employment, you get an increase in the number of cotton mills, you get a sharp reduction in agricultural labor shares, everything that goes into structural change in those locations. And we're going to have a instrumentation strategy that allows us to claim that this is actually causal. Okay, so here's just a little bit of context and background. The individual wealth of people involved in slavery is enormous. So what you see here is Harewood House. It's still owned today by the LaSalle family. They amassed all their wealth from the slave trade, and slave trading itself often led to slave holding in the Caribbean on big plantations. So the second Earl of Harewood, Henry LaSalle, actually received 26,000 pounds compensation. That's about 20 million pounds today, having owned 1,200 slaves. Okay, so this wealth is everywhere. This is actually the library in which I did some of my doctoral work at All Souls College, which used to be known as the Codrington Library and is now the All Souls Library because we've decided that naming things after slaveholders is maybe not the right thing. So the wealth accumulated from this is just gigantic. Now, I'm not going to talk about the related literature. This literature has a whole long lineage. One thing that's important to remember is just how big these compensation payments are. So Britain abolishes slavery in two steps. The slave trade is abolished in 1807, and then the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 provides for compensation for all the people who own slaves. And this amounts to 20 million pounds. That's 40% of government revenue. It's 5% of GDP. It's so big that the only events that Bob Barrow talks about in his piece on borrowing and inflation in Britain is wars and slavery compensation. Okay, so it's a gigantic borrowing shock. You can see it from outer space. So this is giving you a sense of how costly this is. This is the cost per year relative to GDP of different wars, and slavery is like the second most expensive thing the British state does, so the abolishment of slavery. Okay, so what's the data that we're going to use? So here are these claims that people had to file. Then UCL has actually digitized, based on these parliamentary records on who gets compensated, the claims and individuals who got compensated for owning slaves. And from that, we create this geographical database of slave owning in Britain in 1833. Okay, so every dot here is a place where somebody who owned slaves lived or was connected to in the British Isles. The bigger the dot and the darker the color, the more you have. So that's what the geographical distribution looks like. This is what we're going to use as an explanatory variable as a first cut. And then we're going to use a number of variations on this data here, things like the agricultural employment shares in 1851. We're going to control for earlier levels of agricultural employment, all coming from the census. Okay, so that's the kind of data that we have. Let me show you some of the basic patterns. So with no adjustments, no controls, just sort of simple cross sections. Let's not worry about identification as a first step. Okay, so if you just put these two things side by side, on the right-hand side, we have, for example, one measure of economic development that we also have, proximity to cotton mills. And what this seems to suggest is, just from eyeballing the data, it's not a perfect match, but it's also not an absurd idea that these two might be related. And obviously, we're going to have to think about spatial correlation here, which we will do. So if you just do polylines, and you plot the share of people employed in agriculture against the log of number of enslaved held by people in a parish or within a distance of 30 kilometers, you get this brutally downward sloping line where the more slaves are being held by people close to a locality, the lower the share of people employed in agriculture. The distance to cotton mills goes down. You're not necessarily directly right on top of it. We're using parish data. There's 10,000 parishes in England. To just have it in your backyard is maybe unreasonable, but certainly the distance goes down dramatically. So if you don't live in an area where there's slave owners, the distance to a cotton mill is 40 kilometers. If you're right on top of them, if you have lots of slaves being held, then you're almost right on top of them within a distance of 10 kilometers. Mirror image of the share of employment in agriculture is employment in industry of any kind, where if you go from 0 to a high number of enslaved people, the share almost doubles. Okay, now you can go for more specialized categories thanks to the granularity of the 1851 census. So employment in engineering, employment in manufacturing, that's not textiles, machine production, everything goes through the roof as the share of slave owners goes up. Now, of course, that's just sort of basic patterns. You want to control for a million things. You can control for a million things. Here's how that looks. So 1, 2, 3 is basic patterns. 4, 5, 6 is fairly saturated specifications, where we throw in a lot of things that normally condition economic development. The variable of choice survives. It stays large and significant in these exercises. And this is already after clustering at a higher level of geographical aggregation than the parish, 0.5 times 0.5 arc seconds of geographical aggregation. Okay, so now you can sort of drill down into these more specialized professions. You've already seen it in the polylines, but here with all the controls and so forth, you again get these very strong patterns. Everything moves out of agriculture, moves into higher value added things as slave owning goes up. If you do the same thing for 1740, where the data, of course, is scattered and much less reliable, you don't find much. There isn't anything, and the only significant coefficient we get is that there's more agriculture in places where there's more slave owning in 1830. Now, that's not a smoking gun. It could be that slave holding in 1830 is not really very relevant for 1740, but at least it's not the case that this sort of always works. So it's like it's half a step of a placebo that works, we think. Okay. If you go forward in time rather than back, this continues to work. So we find these patterns for 1881, for example, from 50 years after the abolition of slavery. There's still some predictive power. If you actually map the magnitudes, they do go down. Now, let's think about identification, right? So there's a million reasons why this may not be causal, and this may actually not mean much. So how do we think about this? Well, here's one way in which we want to sort of deal with this. As I said before, in the case of Codrington, for example, a lot of the slave traders become slave holders. So here's the number of total slave voyages on the left over time, and on the right, the ones done from British ports with British owners. And we have these records. We know who the owners are on these slave voyages. So one of the key determinants of how profitable a slave voyage was is mortality on the Middle Passage. So this everything about the slave trade is horrendous. This is the most horrendous part of it, where slaves are sort of shackled to the deck of ships and for weeks sailed across the Atlantic, barely given enough water to survive, and many of them die. These are the mortality rates, and you can see, in some cases it reaches 100%. The majority is in the range from 0 to 20. Now, the interesting thing, and the thing that we're going to argue gives us identification, is that first of all, the duration of the Middle Passage, the number of days it takes to sail across the Atlantic, is a very strong predictor of mortality, which is what you would expect, because the ship only has so much fresh water, and if the voyage takes too long because it is the age of sail, there's no wind, then people start to die in large numbers. Now, the interesting thing is that what we do is we connect the slave holders in 1833 through their genealogical tree with people involved in the slave trade. And we take the Middle Passage mortality on the ships that the ancestors of our slaveholders owned and instrument with that slaveholding in 1833. So what's the idea? If your great-great-grandfather owned a slave ship and he didn't make much money from it because half the slaves died, that shock to wealth will either because you're poorer or because you're not convinced that slavery is a great economic strategy, make you less likely to own a great number of slaves. So this is what we use. This is our first stage, and this is the polyline plot on the right-hand side. So we just run the number of enslaved people owned in 1833 against Middle Passage mortality that ancestors of our people experienced when they owned slave ships. And if you do that, this is the first stage, you get pretty strong, pretty significant coefficients. So it passes every possible test. The F statistic is above 100. It does everything you want it to. Okay.
We have 5 minutes left.
Yes, and I will get there. So this is the second stage. So you can do it with controls, without controls. It makes a little bit of a difference, but not a huge one. So if we instrument the number of enslaved people in 1833 with this exposure to Middle Passage mortality, this has strong predictive power for the share of people in agriculture, distance to cotton mills, share of manufacturing. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit about the mechanism. So why would this actually matter? These compensation payments, yes, they're huge. Some people get a lot of them, others get little. But what in the British economy makes this such a potent thing, if you believe our argument? So Eric Williams already argued that industrial expansion required finance. What better man was able to afford the ready capital than a West Indian sugar planter or a Liverpool slave trader? And there's lots of anecdotal evidence. So we can follow the founders of great cotton works and see how many of them are actually in the slave compensation records. And there's lots of examples. We find the same thing for the railway mania. Basically, as soon as we can sort of finger people who put a massive amount of capital into some industrial enterprise, we see exactly these links. So what do we do to sort of firm this up? We go to the British Newspaper Archive and we code up these ads for mortgage wanted and mortgage on offer. Okay, and they're all local because we have almost 100 locations where these are being published. So what do we do then? We total these up as a first cut. We just say, okay, how many are for money being offered and how many of these are for mortgages being demanded? The black line is demand, the blue line is supply. And you can see how these two diverge in the second half of the 1830s, exactly when the slavery compensation payments hit. Then we go one step further and we go back in time before 1830. And we say, you know, mortgage demand, mortgage supply as a function of slaveholders, how does that change? And it's always upward sloping, but the difference in slope between these two is significant. So if you ask yourself, is it the case that mortgage supply is greater than mortgage demand based on what pattern I already saw before 1835 in those places where there's a lot of slave owning after 1835? This is what you get. And if you actually run the diff and diff regression, this is what you find. You find a strong positive interaction effect of after 1835, when the payments become available, and slave owning or slave holding. So this is for mortgage supply, but it's not for mortgage demand. And because of that, we think that one of the key problems in Britain at the time is access to finance. I've written extensively on how bad the British financial system is in terms of intermediating sources of finance. Apparently, this infusion of liquid cash, this helicopter drop of money that comes from this act of parliament, helps to resolve this issue and then maps into faster growth. So what have we shown you? Well, this is the very first cut and the first time we showed this paper almost anywhere. So we're not fully convinced that we have all the moving parts together, but we think we have some suggestive evidence linking slavery with economic development. And the traditional question was, did the slave trade accelerate economic development? And we said, well, the profits of the slave trade are maybe 0.5% of GDP in 1780 or something like that, 0.5% of GDP. But the total profits from slave holding in the Caribbean, maybe 3, 4, 5%, depending on who you believe. So what we argue is that when that slave wealth is made liquid through an act of parliament, this really sort of lubricates the wheels of growth We find that in those areas where people receive the largest compensation because they held the largest number of enslaved people, we see rapid declines in the share in agriculture. We see more employment in industry. We see more industrial establishments in the form of cotton mills. And we think that finance is the key. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Joachim. Thank you. Can you please stop sharing your screen? The floor is now open for questions. Great. So we start with Kevin O'Rourke. Kevin, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. That's really, really interesting stuff, Joachim. I was right with you right until the end when you did the finance thing, which also seems plausible, but it seems a little bit orthogonal to, well, to the literature and to everything else I was thinking as you were going along, because the compensation, it's like a transfer from one group of Brits to another group of Brits, whereas and the wealth that's been accumulated is involved in interaction with the rest of the world. So everything I got, but just that last bit makes.
I don't know if it was just me, Kevin. You seem to sort of fade away acoustically for a second. So what I understood you to ask is, do we really need the finance link? Isn't the accumulation of wealth enough to sort of tell the story? Is that right?
Well, yes, but also like for Williams, the accumulation of wealth. I'm going to point at the microphone. The accumulation of wealth was wealth generated in the Caribbean and brought back to Britain, whereas the wealth that's leading to this mortgage lending, which I found plausible, that's a completely different thing. That's a sort of a reshuffling of capital within Britain. So I don't really see how that particular mechanism ties into the literature the way that everything else you were saying does.
No, it doesn't. We're trying to sort of go beyond the literature, which,
yeah. But is it slavery then?
Let me just sort of clarify. We're not trying to say that the accumulation of wealth, the influx of funds from owning slaves before 1833 didn't matter. I'm pretty convinced that it does, because the numbers are big and it's easy to think why it would make a difference. Then you have this extra thing, and you're right, it's a bit of sort of financial wizardry engineering, right? You take some money and you from mostly Brits, and you give it to some other Brits. Why would that make a difference? Well, welcome to new monetary theory. It's all debt financed, right? And then it goes to some very rich people. So maybe there's the first and possibly only example of trickle-down economics ever having worked on a big scale. Yes, I can think of other mechanisms that would be doing the same. This is one that we can investigate empirically, and I think we have a few things to suggest that it actually works. Something I didn't get to show you is that in those places where you have country banks, we don't find this effect. So where you have something else that also suggests that financial intermediation is working, the effect's flat, we don't find anything. Everything here comes from places where somebody gets compensated. So suddenly some wealth that they have, which is super illiquid, right? You can't just go and sell a slave in order to get a piece of bread. Now they get ready cash. That's where the development is.
Okay, great. We have a question from Steve Brodbury. Steve, over to you.
I'm just wondering, isn't it strange that people who had been investing 3,000 miles away, when they get compensated, invest within a 30-kilometer range in Britain rather than investing anywhere else in the world? And that makes me wonder, do you have any evidence for these investors that they did actually invest in manufacturing locally?
Yeah, so I think there's no shortage of anecdotal evidence. We've always had this, and economic historians have always said it's all anecdotal, and where's the quantitative evidence that would actually pull this, make this convincing? Those can be extended almost ad infinitum. And from everything I know about financial intermediation and the way these enterprises are financed, many of these people know each other. So it's one thing to have a perfectly collateralizable form of investment many kilometers away, often with family, of course, in the Caribbean doing the hard bit of the investment. And then also having investment through local networks. And it doesn't have to be exclusively within 30 kilometers. Of course, it can happen elsewhere. As long as it's differential, I think we're fine.
No, I'm thinking in terms of the expansion of the British Empire in the 19th century. I mean, there's lots of opportunities overseas, and a lot of the literature on investment and industry always sort of says.
And I don't think we have to fight that battle. I'm sure some of these people took their money from the Caribbean and put it into Australia, right? But as long as there's a gradient in where they invest and it has a local effect, even if it's just 5% of their wealth, I don't know. As long as that is there and we can find the impact, then there's a story to tell and one that our data can trace out.
Great, thank you. There is a question from Chris Missioner. You can unmute yourself, Chris.
Thanks. Good to see you, Joachim. This is really interesting. My question is, it was sort of addressed in your reply to Steve, but it was about the wealth holding of the slaveholders prior to slaveholding. So in the sense that we would think that the most likely individuals to purchase slaves could also be wealthy individuals. And I wanted to connect that thought to the mechanism that you outlined at the end, which is to say, ex ante, as you pointed out, investing in slaves was a very risky endeavor. Getting the slaves transported to sugar plantations in the Caribbean was no small feat. So were these investors like super forward looking, and could see that they were going to realize this capital gain? That you're focusing on the essentially the realization of that capital gain as this financial shock. Or was it that they just had accumulated wealth, and they were able to, deploy that, and so the ones that were most likely to engage in this were just rich people. So I kind of want to understand, are these super smart investors that were forward looking, or are they just rich people who happen to look around and say, well, let's just do this?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things went into being a successful slave trader. So there are people who rise from relatively modest backgrounds. Interestingly, there's quite a few people who are the children of reverends and so forth. So they come from normal sort of middle class families. Some of them then make it big in the slave trade. I guess having a certain elastic conscience helps. Maybe that's where the synergy with being the son of clergyman comes in. But they're clearly risk-taking. Some of them get lucky. So, a lot of sort of factors combine here to be a successful slave trader. But the interesting thing is that, of course, that the people that we find, the slave trade has already been abolished for a quarter of a century by the time we see them in the compensation records. So this is all the effect of their ancestors having done this. Some of it is luck, some of it is skill. And then, the extremely high rates of return, my personal view of slave holding, make these people almost rich on autopilot. There's discussion in the literature about this, but there's lots of anecdotal evidence that these people are almost all fabulously wealthy, at least the ones that do well with their plantations, down to the point of, King George sort of looking longingly at the carriage, the best carriage in town, and saying that must be a West Indies trader. It's the equivalent of a Lamborghini. Right? And if the king envies you, you're doing well. So these people at some point started out not that rich. Then their ancestors did get rich. So the Codrington, for example, that I used as an example, the slave trade in Codrington is the first one who actually gets ennobled. And then, 100 years later, his descendants are super rich slaveholders. So it's a combination of these two things.
Great. We have a few questions in the Q&A. Let me read them loud. The first one is from Walker Hanlon. Conceptually, if you tax a broad population, reallocate the proceeds unequally across locations, it makes sense that those locations receiving the redistribution become relatively better locations for capital investment. But I don't see how we can go from this relative effect to an aggregate effect. How do we know that these didn't just reallocate investment across locations?
No, that's right. So we don't, we have a model that answers, if you believe it, the general equilibrium questions. Excuse me. The econometric evidence that I've shown you does not clinch that argument. Because it could be that I take from Peter and give to Paul.
Sorry, Joachim. Yes. I think I'm going to read the other questions, and then you see we have a few seconds then for you to answer them. Let me just select them among those who have not yet asked a question. We have Guillaume Dodin. Thanks for this great work. I understand you are showing an important regional effect of the compensation, but do you think this is just a redistributive effect between British regions, or can we extend your conclusions to a positive effect for Britain as a whole through general increased liquidity?
Yeah, so if it's just taking money away from the poor taxpayers of Britain, having to pay excise taxes on their beloved beer, or import taxes on sugar and tobacco, and then it goes into the pockets of wealth holders, you could think that there might be non-homotheticities that actually allow you to argue that this is good for the growth process. Depends on how important collateral constraints are. And many models of growth today have a prominent role for collateral constraints. So that's easy to sort of think about conceptually. It's almost impossible to show regression. I think there's something in that, but there's this more important thing, which I don't want to sort of put to one side just because we're using the compensation payment, which is debt finance. There is massive accumulation of wealth. Think about that house of the LaSalle family. That's all built on the sweat and exploitation and death of human beings in the Caribbean. And that wealth then is made liquid, which may have economic consequences, but it has to be there in the first place. And that's what seems to be driving an important part of growth in Britain. And we haven't had a good way of sort of think about this and show this quantitatively, because the only thing that people have, that most of this literature has done until now is to do these aggregate calculations of what are the profits from the slave trade, are they higher than profits elsewhere? The difference between the two is the possible contribution to British GDP, and I think that's all wrong.
Thank you very much, Joachim. We now continue with our last presenter. So our next speaker is Eva Frankema. Eva is a professor of rural and environmental history at the University of Wageningen. Today, he will present his paper on the long-term effects of the expansion of mass education in the Global South. Over to you, Eva.
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me clearly, Martina?
Yes, yes,
okay,
it's perfect.
And I'm sitting close enough to my laptop, that helps. And I'll try to put my screen into the presentation mode. It takes a while. There we go. Is it clearly visible for you?
Yes, it's good. You are on mute.
Unmute. Yes, there I am again. Thanks to the organizers for giving me this slot in the program. I'd like to introduce a paper that I'm writing together with Marloes van Waaijenburg. This paper has been a real struggle for over 5 years now, and last month we decided that it's actually not a paper but a book project. So I will present something that is now sort of in the process of merging or transforming from a paper into a book project. It is a large issue. The issue is centered around economic historians' views of how educated labor is key to economic growth and economic development, and a more particular strand of literature within that framework that looks particularly at the race between education and technology. I'm referring here to this very nice book by Golden and Katz, who basically argue that much of the US technological leadership in the 20th century has to be understood via that particular dynamic, the fact that the US has a very highly educated and flexible labor force. Now, long-run views of how human capital accumulates and how it changes have focused largely on the West, also because the data is out there. But we provocatively put the question on the table, what about the rest of the world? And then more specifically, what ways of thinking should we develop when we look at technology introductions in colonial settings? That is, so we're not interested in the relationship between human capital or education and innovation or invention, but we're interested in how schooling responds and relates to the introduction of technologies from abroad in a colonial context. And this particularly occurs in large parts of Africa and Asia between the 1850s and the 1970s. This is a rough temporal demarcation, but one can think of the building of railroads, the extension very much of colonial bureaucracies, administrative functions, the establishment of banking, all sorts of engineering activities, the introduction of electrical appliance, machinery. So we're talking about a context, a colonial economic context in which there is a great demand for new type of skills, or at least a different type of skills than people had in those times. So there is a shock, a technology shock coming into these systems, and there is an educational response. Now, there has been quite a substantial literature about this, as well as there's a lot of literature about the onset of mass education. I think there are now over 50 papers that do something with missionary schooling and long-term development, for instance. But what we observe is that these two developments, that is the introduction of new technologies, machinery, via the investments that we're just talking about, colonial investments into these economies, and the onset of mass education, that particular link remains very much under-researched when we focus on the global south and in this imperial setting. And that leads to a number of questions. How did labor markets change? Social historians have done a lot of work on this, but they don't particularly ask the type of economic history questions. Did schooling, the dissemination of schooling effectively cater to changing, rising demand in response of these technological innovations that were introduced in these societies? Did alternative forms of training and skill transfer emerge? So beyond the missionary school, or beyond the public schools or the private schools that were being established? Who went to school? What were the effects of labor market regulation, all of these systems? Now, these are 5 very broad questions. I'm not going to answer a single one of them, but it gives you sort of the scope of the program that we are interested in, simply because we think that there's still a lot to learn about how this all works, and there's the literature on it is really thin, so there is a research agenda here. Another question is, what is the role of skilled labor migration in all of this? Now, the first step, and that is a step that we took years ago, was to build a skill premium data for occupations for which we could retrieve that data. So we take skill premiums as an indicator of relative supply and demand. For the moment, long-term series are available for the Western world. We've built a large-scale database on skill premiums in colonial Africa and Asia for about 50 countries. These are mainly wage observations that we do in the main urban areas, and they stretch the period 1870-2010 mainly. They can be, if you're interested in looking at the data, they are published now on the African Economic History Network website. Now, what these data allows us to do is not the type of things that we can do for Europe, tracing a development of carpenter premiums, for instance, back centuries in time, like the graph here shown, based on the work by Greg Clark. We can have a very long-run view, a nice view of what a carpenter premium over an unskilled wage worker wage looks like. But we can do sort of similar stuff in a shorter time frame for a lot of these areas. These are the countries that are included in our database. For some countries, we have several major urban areas. For India, for instance, we have at least 6, 7 series. For most countries, we focus only on one city because that's what the data pertains to. A little bit more about the database. The skill premium, we take the convention. We simply divide the observed wage of the skilled worker over the wage of the unskilled worker, and then express it as a percentage share over the unskilled worker's wage. We take care in our database to focus on adults, male, indigenous workers, so no European workers in this data set. And as I said, they are mainly working in urban areas. And we can construct pretty good series for at least 5 occupations: carpenters. And these are carpenters were known in these worlds. It is not a particularly new occupation, but electricians and car mechanics are clearly new occupations. So for these type of jobs, we have these series. We also have constructed a lot of series, comparable series of lower grade clerks and bank tellers as a proxy for white collar occupations. Where did we take the data from? Well, from everywhere we could take data. For the British colonies, we relied on the Blue Books, labor reports, wages and price statistics. For the French colonies, there are comparable type of sources, but they have different names. For the post-1950 era, we rely mostly on the ILO October inquiries. That's a more systematic set of data that takes us straight into the 21st century. And we have a lot of sort of other statistical sources from individual countries, ranging from the historical statistics of Japan to the Philippines Statistical Bulletin, for instance. So that is as far as our sources go. Our starting point is, let's take unskilled and skilled wages always from the same source. Let's make sure there is temporal consistency in those sources. So we take our series from one single source and we cross-check overlapping years when we switch between sources. There is heterogeneity in wage series, certainly across empires, not so much within, we would say, and we may have a problem, but we don't think that problem is that large with wages that we observe from the government sector, that are from government reports, and private sector wages. I don't have time to comment a lot on it, but I can do it perhaps in the Q&A. This I covered. Let's continue. Just to give you a flavor, this is the type of sources that we're looking at year after year after year, of course, pulling it into Excel files. These are French sources where we take skilled and unskilled workers from. These are other sources. Well, you can see you get an impression what we have been using. And the other type of data that we collect are pictures. So we are very much interested in what actually happens in these schools. What type of skills are these young guys and girls learning? What did those places look like? So from missionary reports, from the archives, we collect as many pictures as we can from these schools. And you get another sort of perspective on what is happening when we talk about sort of the onset of mass education or the schooling revolution. Of course, this gives us then the opportunity to construct time series for unskilled wages, for wage workers, and then I will now jump to the 3 main findings. Perhaps the 3 main patterns are a better word, and I will talk most of my presentation. I will talk you through the 3 main patterns. These are overarching patterns that are sort of macro trends that hide a lot of internal variation, which I will talk a little bit about. This is the first finding, and that is based on our collection of these carpenter series. And when we constructed this database, one thing that occurred to us is that there really is a huge distinction between what a carpenter around 1900 in an average African country can fetch over an unskilled worker compared to the Western world. And what you can also see from this graph is that there is really a clear Asia-Africa distinction. In Africa, skilled workers, and I'll show you the other occupations in a minute, are far more expensive around 1900 on average than they are in Asia. There is one Asian country, Japan, that really performs like a Western country in the sense that these premiums are really low. They're at a level that we observe in the US or in Europe. But for most of these Asian societies, we talk about cities here or African cities. The price of hiring skilled workers is really high. What can we say more about this? The other thing I want to emphasize here is when you study the African sample, you see a lot of variation in these skill premiums, but it sort of resonates with what we think we know about the relative economic development in these places. I'm not surprised that in countries like Senegal, Ghana, Gambia, Nigeria, the skill premiums are quite a lot lower than in countries in Central Africa, like Botswana or Mali, or in Cote d'Ivoire, for instance. So it sort of, it confirms to a picture we had in our mind. But the key thing here is that there is a distinction between Asia and Africa that is potentially very important in understanding why Asia developed very differently in the 20th century than Africa. If we put it in a long run perspective and we simply glue all the data together on a continental level, then you get another impression of how dramatic the transition actually is in the skill premiums. So if we look at a red line, that's Africa total. We can split it up in all these countries, but if we merge it and we aggregate it, then you get a feel for what is a particularly dramatic transition in the price of skilled labor. We see the same occurring in Asia. This is Asia excluding Japan and China, I should say. Japan is over here. Japan is the only country that really is in the late 19th century, sort of at a Western level. The rest comes from a higher level, but converges to Western levels in the 20th century.
Yes, 5 minutes left.
How many?
5 minutes.
Yes, perfect. That's that will give me enough time to sort of convey some other of these patterns. Is this a Carpenter-specific story? No. Far from it. We see similar trends for car mechanics. Well, you can only have a car mechanic when there are cars. This is typically a new occupation. Car mechanics did not exist in 19th century Africa. They did exist in the 20th century. And there we see these declines coming from 700% over an unskilled wage in what have you, Burkina Faso, to 50% today. So it suggests there is a major transition going on in these labor markets. We see the same trends in Asia for those countries for which we've been able to collect these data. We just see the same pattern for electricians. If we compare the 1940s, 1950s to later in the 20th centuries, those relative prices are dropping, and that drop is universal. We see it everywhere. Same happens in Asia, with the exception perhaps of Japan and some other countries here, where those skill premiums were already at a fairly low level. For white-collar labor, those drops are dramatic as well. Should not surprise us. The vast majority of that labor force was illiterate in the late 19th century. And of course, there has been a whole literacy wave making the supply of white-collar laborers, people who can read and write, do some counting, for instance, making that much cheaper. For bank tellers, we see similar tendencies, and we see similar tendencies in Asia as well. Now we want to get our finger behind this Africa-Asia gap, and we're curious what we should think of this dramatic fall in skill premiums that we see for a lot of these occupations, including the 5 that I just showed to you. What is this? Is this just a response in terms of schooling that is very effective in a way, because it drives down the prices of all these skills that people need in performing these occupations? Is that what is going on, or are there other mechanisms at the backside that are complementary to sort of the inroad of mass education that can help us sort of make sense of the data? Well, we can use the Barrow and Lee data set to make a first guess about, how much of these trends can be explained by years of schooling or literacy rates. That is what we have done. I'll very quickly show you scatter plots. The red dots are Africa. The black dots are Asia. You can see there is a clear relationship, a correlation at least, between the share of educated to non-educated people and Carpenter skill premiums. We use these skill premiums because that is our most balanced data set that we have right now. We can also observe that for a lot of countries when we plot those trends chronologically, so over time. And when we do it in a regression, and this is one of the things we're struggling with, so any type of feedback on this would be great. And then we can clearly see here, just an OLS panel regression, that there is a neat effect, an effect that we would expect of increasing literacy rates are lowering, are associated with lower skill premiums. That effect holds across the board. Also, if you put in an Africa dummy here, for instance, when the skill premiums are up. But when we plug in time fixed effects and country fixed effects, that effect totally disappears. And that, puzzles us. Why do the regressions not work the way we would like to see them work? We can look at the time of effects estimates of this regression over time, and we can clearly see that there tends to be a break around the 1940s. And that is sort of our next step into this whole research, because that puts us on the trajectory of all sorts of institutional interventions into these labor markets, which cannot be neglected. These were not free labor markets, so to speak. It's not only a matter of supply and demand, and then you get a price. There is, of course, a lot of regulation.
You have 1 minute left.
Yes, I will conclude by showing you 2 more slides. One of these regulations is, of course, forced labor, which was practiced throughout colonial Asia and colonial Africa. One of the things that may be going on here is that the abolition of forced labor, either through independence or by law in colonial Africa, has an effect on the skill premiums that we are observing, namely by driving up the price of unskilled labor. Unskilled labor may have been artificially cheap under these type of systems. That is something we want to look at as well. Migration is another aspect of this story that we want to write a chapter about and we want to look into. There are questions about, social mobility, for which we have sources, but I don't have time. I want to go to the conclusions. I think the main message that I want to convey is that there is a research agenda here, not only for us, but for many people. This is just very interesting stuff. And it would complement the tremendous knowledge that we already have about, the relationship between human capital accumulation and innovation in Western countries. We need to do this for the global South as well. For that, we can do much more than building this skill premium data set. At least it is a first step. There are 3 new general patterns that I wanted to share with you. These skill premiums were much higher than in the West in the late 19th century. Also for other occupations, there's great convergence in the 20th century, and there is a distinct Africa-Asia gap. I want to leave it here, not to run out of time. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Evan. You can stop sharing your screen. And it's now time for questions. While we wait, perhaps I start with the first one. Can you tell us something more about the role of migration, both internal and international migration? And in particular, I think about the role of skilled migrant labor in reducing the skill premium. And if you look at the heterogeneity among countries and the variation over time, you look at very different countries, right, within the 2 regions.
Yeah. No, that is true. There is, of course, a tremendous amount of variation that we are talking about. Migration will certainly have played a role, but with very different effects in local labor markets. And these are these urban labor markets. And our hunch is that the immigration into colonial Asia from China, for instance, into Southeast Asia, but also from India, is very important, and that is a type of immigration that we don't see in Africa to that extent. There is immigration of European skilled workers, for instance, to set up mines, for instance, but not to that extent of African skilled workers. So there is much more local training going on. For instance, in the Belgian Congo, the mining operations are very expensive because it requires a lot of skilled labor, particularly when electrical appliances are needed. At first, Europeans are sort of catering to that demand, but in the 1920s and the 1930s, Africans are taking over those jobs, and they are locally trained. And the reason they want this is because they are much cheaper than flying in Europeans to do these type of jobs. And as I said, in Asia, I think the immigration plays a much larger role in that respect than in most African economies.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, anybody? Please either raise your electronic hand or just write in the chat. Perhaps then I will ask another question while we wait. Can you say something about the quality of skills, the quality of learning outcomes? Of course, going back in time, you obviously don't have data like the PISA data, but is there a way for you to somehow take into account the variation in the quality of skills?
That will be very difficult because the quality of those skills would have differed from person to person, and it will have depended a lot on the training as well, right? And even within these occupations, one carpenter is not, can be incomparable to another carpenter. So it is that is very difficult. The skills that you require as a car mechanic will also change over time, and so that capturing that variation. If somebody could point me to a data source to say more about this, that's extremely hard. I don't see how we could find that out. Yeah, but at least what we can see from the curricula and from the pictures that we are getting from those archives is what type of skills people are actually learning. And what type of machinery people are engaging with. And that you can see from this photographic archive.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Steve Broadberry. Steve, you can unmute yourself.
I was just wondering if you had looked at the data for Latin America. That's kind of interesting because it has some countries around 1900 that are at pretty much Western levels. Argentina, but you've also got much poorer ones. I mean, do we get the same patterns there, and where would they fit on the scale of the premium relative to Africa and Asia?
Yeah, we did not do that, Steve, because we thought that by covering Asia and Africa, we already had enough. We had more than we could handle, at least in one paper. But I take your point. I think we should do that. If this is sort of more of a story for the global South, I think we should include Latin America as well. So we can do that, but I cannot answer your question because I don't know.
Fair enough.
Okay, let me check if there are any remaining questions. No, I don't see any. Oh, yes, we have a question from Tobias Trauma. Tobias, over to you.
Yes, thanks very much for this interesting presentation. Do you see any pattern between French and British colonies in Africa? I just saw that some of the British colonies have much lower skill premiums than, for instance, Côte d'Ivoire, but that may be accidental.
Yeah, that's also very a question that we have sort of been thinking before. There are differences. So in the French colonies, the skill premiums are even higher, which may suggest that the schooling system sort of develops more slowly there than in the British colonies. That is what we know from the literature and also from the data. But I should add that the variation within the empires is also particularly large. So Senegal is part of French West Africa, and it has the lowest skill premiums across the board, right? So a lot of this is thinking in terms of the more developed regions in Africa, coastal developed regions versus the hinterland. And in the hinterland, a lot of cities were just had no skilled people. There were no skilled people because there were no training facilities. So In Niger, for instance, the skill premiums for a carpenter are still remain 500%, which is extremely expensive. And the first mission school that is established in one of these cities is from the 1920s, which is fairly late. So we see it also a temporal gap in the way sort of these systems develop when you go from the coast into the hinterland.
Great. We have a few questions in the Q&A. I'm going to read them. The first one is from David Mitch. Very interesting, a data question. To what extent do many of the carpenter and other skill data come primarily from colonial government positions, where these positions largely held by Europeans initially? And does that explain the break around 1940 with increasing independence? Let me read the last one from Thomas Vonio. Is the decline of the skill premium and convergence over time a consequence of population growth in the 20th century? I'm thinking that population density, and especially urban population density, would impact on the supply of all kinds of labor. Over to you. You have 1 minute to answer.
That will be more than enough. David, thanks for your question. I can see why you asked that question, because I did not tick that box during my presentation, but it's not the way you suggest it may work. So all the sources that we covered clearly distinguish the wages of European carpenters from Asian carpenters, from African carpenters. So a lot of these sources make that distinction. The reason why they do it is because European carpenters earn much more. They earn a factor 20 compared to an African unskilled worker, and perhaps a factor 4 or 5 more than the African carpenter. So that feature of our sources actually allows us to sort of distract or distill a series that is really based on indigenous labor, and it is sort of the transition from skilled people from Europe towards indigenous people does occur in some sectors. We can clearly observe that, and we also know why it happened. And that is particularly in the mining sector in Africa, where you can see that. But in most of these countries where we are talking about very few Europeans who are working in this local economy. So this is really fetched from a local source. It's local training. There are even sort of guild-like structures established next to these schools that train people in order to become a carpenter or a car mechanic or an electrician. So there's a whole world next to what we would conceive of as formal schooling that caters to these local economies.
Okay, great. Thank you. Perfect timing. It's the end of today. Thank you to our speakers and to all the participants for the insightful presentations and discussions. The next session of the conference, which focuses on state capacity and institutions and trade and oppressions, start tomorrow at 2 p.m. British Summer Time. I wish you all a great rest of the day. Goodbye.